If members could be bringing themselves to order, please. Yeah, absolutely. Right, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to what is probably the coolest building in Maidstone at the moment, temperature-wise. It probably will warm up a bit, unfortunately. There is no fire drill planned this evening, as far as I'm aware, so if the alarm goes off, assume it is either a genuine alarm or that the electric circuit is simply overheated. In either case, the Democratic Services officers will establish a safe way out of the building and hopefully show us what it is. Now, the Council does record and store the records of its meetings. It also broadcasts them live. Can I ask if anyone other than the Council's official webcasting service is intending to record this meeting? No? That was simply so that we know whether anyone is going to do that, not in order to stop anyone. Right, on with the agenda for this evening. Item 1, apologies for absence. I have had apologies from Councillor Kimantz and Councillor Reeves. Can I see any substitute members? Councillor Cox?
Councillor Cox for Councillor Kimantz.
And Councillor Bryce?
Councillor Bryce for Councillor Eaves.
Thank you much. Notification of visiting members. I've seen Councillor Webb somewhere.
Agenda item 15 and 16.
Thank you very much. Councillor McLaughlin, I see over the back there. Thank you very much. Are there any other visiting members? Are you intending to speak on any? Okay, thank you. Just as a note, if you're not intending to speak on an item, you don't necessarily need to declare that you're here, although it's nice to know, but you don't have to. Item 4, items withdrawn from the agenda. We do have one item that will be hopefully withdrawn from the agenda. This is item 14 on page 50. Unfortunately, this is not actually a valid planning application at the moment because the notice of land ownership was served on the wrong parties, so it has to be reserved. And once that's done, it will come back for consideration. Is it agreed that that item is withdrawn? Agreed. Thank you, members. Should make it slightly more quick. Proceed to item 5, date of the adjourned meeting. This is the 29th of August. I hope we won't have to come back, but if we do, 6 p.m, 29th of August. Item 6, any business the Chairman regards as urgent, including the urgent update report as it relates to matters to be considered at the meeting. Members, we do have an urgent update report. Is it agreed we take that? Agreed. Thank you, members. Item 7, disclosures by members and officers. I believe Councillor Bryce has a disclosure.
Sorry, Chair, I was just going to say I don't have the urgent update. No. I have an interest in item 17, so I'll make a representation and then I'll check with legal, but potentially leave the chamber if you need me to, but I won't sit for that item.
Item 8, declarations of lobbying. Oh, sorry, Councillor Harwood, I missed you. Another disclosure.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. I think, well, I do need to declare that in relation to item 21, land to the rear of 90 Alcombe Road, that I'm a member of Boxley Parish Council but took no part in any discussion. However, at no point in the report does it mention the fact that this is actually in Boxley Parish, because the boundary line is the rear of the properties in Alcombe Road. So even though the property that's quoted, number 90 Alcombe Road, is in the urban area of Maidstone, the area of the old Vinters Park to the rear is in Boxley Parish. The reason why I hesitate is I wonder whether the appropriate consultation was undertaken.
It's not a question I can actually answer at the moment. Mr. Gallivan, are you able to assist us with that question? I'll give you a few minutes when we come back to that.
But anyway, I'm a member of the parish council, but I took no part in any discussion, but it sounds like neither did they, so therefore I wouldn't have done, would I?
Councillor Perry.
Thank you, Chairman. It's agenda item 17. I'm one of the ward members for Staplehurst, but I'm also a member of the parish council, but I am not a member of the planning committee of the parish council, and I take no part deliberately in any discussions on planning issues. So I will be speaking, and I may be predisposed, but I'm not predetermined, and I'll be interested to hear
an important distinction.
Yeah, very important distinction. So I will be speaking and voting, hopefully. Thank you.
Right, okay, thank you very much. Right, any other disclosures? No. Item 8, disclosures of lobbying we will take with the individual applications. Item 9, to consider whether any item should be taken in private because of the possible disclosure of exempt information. I'm not aware of any, so I intend to take the entire agenda in public. Is that agreed? Agreed. Thank you. Item 10, minutes of the meeting of the 25th of July. These have all been circulated. Are there any queries with the minutes, or can I sign those as an accurate record? Thank you very much. Right, item 11, presentation of petitions, if any. There are none this evening. Item 12, deferred items. Pages 13 to 14, are there any updates on deferred items? Well, I don't believe there are. There are only two here, both in Stylebridge Lane, and I'm not aware of any updates, so we will move on to the agenda. Now, that brings us to the issue of the land to the rear of 90 Alcombe Road. Are we aware, can you see where any consultation has taken place with the parish council?
The system confirms that we consulted a parish. It doesn't say which parish.
Well, it must be Boxley. It must be Boxley. I can't imagine it would be any other parish. I don't think Staplehurst or Tovall, for example, have a particular view on it. So we will proceed on the basis that they have been consulted. And I will ask the officer to introduce the report, but only if members are wishing to speak to it, because there is no one else, Councillor Harwood or anyone else intending to speak to it. Okay, in that case, given the state of the tree following the lightning, I've moved the officer's recommendation. Thank you very much. Have a nice evening. Right. We now move on to item 18 on page 96, land south of Forstall Lane, Cox Heath, Kent. Members will recollect the situation with this. First of all, can I take any declarations of lobbying on this particular application? Councillor Round, Councillor Wilby, Councillor Mumford, anyone else? Councillor Harwood. Right. Is anyone wishing to speak to this application? Because we have had an amendment. Councillor Harwood, do you wish to move the recommendation?
Yeah, I'm very happy to move the recommendation now. I'm very sad that we had to get to where we are the way we did. However, I'm happy to move the as per the papers, the updated.
Seconded. In that case, I'll put the recommendation to the vote. Those in favour? That's everyone, so I don't need to take any further votes. Right, now our rapid progress will slow. And we move to item 13 on page 15, and I ask the officer to introduce what will be a report that we actually do have to hear.
Thank you, Chair. Members have a detailed officer report setting out descriptions of the site, the proposal, its surroundings, and running through the main issues. So what I'll do now is just take you through the site, the setting, and the images of the development. It is a planning application for 170 residential units. Car parking is provided at 50%, so 85 units. The units are a mixture of 18 one-bedroomed, 125 two-bed, and 27 three-bedroomed flats. There is no affordable housing on site, but the applicant has proposed a financial contribution which is the equivalent of circa 10% affordable housing. There are also proposals for contributions towards open space and community provision of circa £250,000 each. The site is the site of the historic KCC library campus. So you can see the location here. You've got the barracks to the east, to the west, can't see it very well on this picture, the Springfield Mansion. The site is on the main northeastern route out of the town centre, the River Medway to the west. If we zoom in a little bit more, you can see the existing structure, the sort of book tower on the site. That's the only remaining structure. Everything else has now been demolished. To the north of the site, you can see residential development, which varies between 2 and 3 stories in height. To the west, more residential development going up to 4 stories. Again, the listed Springfield Mansion, Grade 2 listed. And to the south, what appears on here as a vacant site is now the site of the Western Home scheme that's under construction. Again, looking at the site plan, this is the position of Springfield Mansion or Springfield House, the main road, and then the residential developments to the north and west. This is the view of the site from Chatham Road. This is effectively the junction of Chatham Road and the 229, looking west into the site. So the Medway is down the valley behind. Again, you can see the sole remaining building on the site. This is a winter photograph, so many of the trees aren't in leaf. This is a view into the site from the west, so effectively from the entrance to Bamborough Court. You can see again, all the buildings have now gone except for the book tower. You can see the existing trees on the frontage to Chatham Road. Springfield Mansion faces towards the site. Between the two is an area of car parking and the access road to the residential units. This is an extension of that access road, so you can see to the left the 4-storey development and beyond the Radnor Close, which is 2 and 3 stories. It's probably worth recognising that Radnor Close, even where it goes to 3 stories, is set significantly below the application site. So you can see this retaining wall. The application site is on the right and the residential estate is at a significantly lower level. And this is the public realm, as it were, between the residential developments and the site. So you can see that it's a very narrow strip dominated by access and car parking. There's no amenity open space as such within the immediate setting of the two uses. In terms of the context of the Western Home site, this is the building under construction. This element here rises between 12 and 18 stories. As a reminder, the application at its tallest is 16. The site no longer has the benefit of a valid planning permission, but when the site was acquired by the applicant, this was the original KCC permission for 114 units in buildings varying between 4 and 6 stories. That permission has now lapsed. The scheme has been before the council for 2 years and has been the subject of lengthy discussions in relation to design and other planning merits. I won't go through the detailed design evolution other than to summarise on these 2 slides. Top left, the building as originally submitted, which was a bulkier structure, the same ultimate height, but you can see it stepped down gradually. The scheme that I'll talk you through has evolved into a simpler 3-block form. So they've taken away much of the massing, the out-of-context materials, but the height is still the same, and the unit numbers have actually gone up slightly from 162 to 170 because they've made the building more efficient and taken out the community space. This sketch sort of shows where the two areas of bulk have been reduced through discussions on the scheme over the previous 2 years. This is the footprint of the building. So it's a constrained site in that you have a series of TPO'd trees on the eastern and southern boundaries. And a key requirement of the scheme has been the retention of the maximum number of trees on site. The previous KCC permission resulted in the loss of a large number of those existing trees, and the applicant has sought to retain all but 6 more minor specimens. And that degree of intervention has been considered acceptable by the tree officers. But what members will note is that once you take away the belt of trees and the footprint of the building and car parking, there is no amenity space within the scheme between it and the housing to the west. And if you recall the photograph, you would have seen that that isn't a particularly attractive piece of public realm between the two. There is some amenity space proposed on the building. These are sort of excerpts of the various roof plans. So at 6th floor and the 16th floor, there are 2 arrays of PV panels as part of the renewable energy element of the scheme. But in the central block, it is proposed to incorporate a roof garden. Originally, this roof garden was larger and went on to all 3 levels, but in order to accommodate the PV solution, this has reduced. In terms of the appearance of the building, this is the view effectively from Chatham Road and the 229. You can see a series of buildings rising from 6 stories adjacent to Radnor Close, and that level change I highlighted with the retaining wall is about there, to 9 in the middle and 16 at the top. Reversing the image, you can see again the sort of hierarchy of building blocks. This view doesn't exist. You'd be floating above Radnor Close to get to this view, but this shows you the series of buildings. It doesn't do the development favour in that the building is snaking away from the viewpoint, so it isn't as wide as it looks there. This is the closest part. That part is some distance away. So don't assume that the building is that wide in all the views. This is the view from the Western Home Scheme. You can see that the taller element dominates that. In terms of materials, as I mentioned at the beginning, the scheme has evolved since the original submission, and the architects have introduced a more sympathetic palette of materials in terms of brickwork that takes from local references. But the issue is not necessarily with the materials themselves, but the form, scale, and density of the building. There are some CGIs which we believe to be accurate that again show those views more realistically. So again, this is the view from the grass verge on the corner of Chatham Road and the 229. You can see how the building zigzags to retain trees and steps down towards the north. This is the view from Banbridge Court, sort of looking out of their parking area. Radnor Close is off to the left. Again, you can see the hierarchy of buildings and the use of different materials. And again, the view from the Western Homes site. This is a view from the footbridge, the main pedestrian route from the development. If you don't want to suffer the traffic of the 229, is to go over this footbridge and then back down through the more traditional estates into the town centre. This is the view from that footbridge across. It doesn't show the Western Homes tower on that view. I've got some drawings that show the two together. So this drawing, it doesn't read very well, but it shows the relative heights of the two developments. So this is the building. What you saw in the photograph has been constructed to that height, but they're sort of finishing off the external envelope and the internal fit out. So that rises to 18 stories. The application site is 16-storey, but because of the sort of level difference as you go up the hill out of town, it doesn't look a whole 2 stories lower on section. The lower two pictures sort of show the cumulative impact of the two buildings together, and I think it's an important consideration that members have regard to the difference between the single tall intervention of the Western Home Scheme and the impact that this application and that we'll have together. These photo montages show the Western Homes building in outline and the application building CGI'd into it. This image shows the application as originally submitted, not the latest design. So the bulk is very slightly different, but the height and broad massing remains the same. So this is the view from the footbridge if you were north of the site coming back into town. This shows the view from the park on the western side of the river. You can see part of the existing building there. That is the net change to the proposal. Again, bear in mind that the detailing is slightly different. So if I go back and forth, you can see the net change between the two. And that then shows the inclusion of the Western Homes building into that view. So that is the resulting cumulative view from the park. Same exercise from the crossing over the river. You can just see the existing tower. You can see the degree of change from the proposal and the cumulative impact with the Western Homes scheme. And on this view, you can see the lower element of the Western Homes development, which isn't yet under construction. That, I believe, is circa 8 stories in height. So that is the form, the character and the appearance of the proposal. You have the officer's report setting out the considerations on the various matters, so we'd be happy to take any questions.
No, we don't. Sorry, no, we don't do questions. Sorry, we don't do questions at this stage of the procedure. Later on, maybe. Right, now we need to explain to members of the public how the speaking works this evening. I'll turn to the legal officer for that.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is a short announcement for members of the public, and in particular those who are speaking on an item this evening. As you've just heard, the item is announced by the chairman, and then the planning officer introduces the item, and the chairman will then call the speakers. When you hear your name called, please could you come forward to the table in front of you and take a seat. To speak, press the middle button on the unit. You do not need to hold it down. The button will turn green and the ring around the mouthpiece on the microphone will turn red. You will have 3 minutes to speak and you'll see your time counting down on the screen in the corner behind me. At the end of your 3 minutes, the chairman will tell you when your time is up. Once you've finished speaking, please press the middle button on the unit again and it will turn white and then return to your seat. You may hear some of the speakers referred to as visiting members. They are members of the council, but they don't sit on this committee. They also have 3 minutes to speak, but they have no right to vote on any of the applications. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Right, the only speaker I have listed is Mr. Nellis for the applicant, so if you'd like to come forward, sir.
Good evening. Tennyson Gardens is a gateway scheme submitted in October 2017. It has been amended several times at the request of your officers. It was referred to this committee in November 2018 with a recommendation for refusal based solely on the lack of contributions. Within that committee report, all other elements of the scheme were found to be acceptable, including the design and potential impacts. Following its withdrawal, we've worked closely with your officers to overcome the challenge of value engineering this scheme, whilst retaining as much of the quality as possible and even in some areas enhancing it. Viability and design is a finely balanced matter, but the scheme now delivers affordable housing plus contributions and high quality design. Chris Mila, who is one of the country's leading specialists in heritage and tall buildings, has provided an expert opinion which agrees that the design is of a high quality. The majority of your case officers who have worked on this application and have had a detailed input into the design and, in my opinion, would share Chris Mila's view. It's important to consider the context, especially against the 18-storey tower being constructed next door by Western Homes. In combination, these buildings will create a gateway into the Springfield campus. However, the neighbouring schemes have a much greater density and the Western Home Tower has a greater bulk and mass. given that our building has a maximum of 16 stories and is significantly more slender and elegant. The scheme delivers 1.2 million in CAL, 604,000 off-site affordable housing being the equivalent of a 10% provision, 252,000 towards open space and 250,000 for a new community facility in the area. We are aware that St Faith's Church are constructing a new community centre nearby. Our scheme delivers a greater parking ratio than the previously approved scheme and is at similar levels to the neighbouring sites. A robust travel plan has been submitted which proposes a range of mitigation measures such as a one-on-one cycle storage, free car club membership and a car sharing scheme, to name just a few. Our scheme has been successful in preserving all of the Grade A and Grade B listed trees, which is far greater than the previously approved scheme, which lost the majority of these trees. A landscaping condition could be imposed to address any other concerns that members may have. Given Maidstone's requirement for almost 18,000 new homes over its plan period, delivering high-density schemes on urban, sustainable brownfield sites will contribute towards alleviating pressures to build in the countryside or rural locations. This site has been vacant for a number of years and still hosts a 13-storey tower, and its regeneration would have a positive effect on the community. As responsible developers, we give back to the communities we work in. For example, our commitment to the Maidstone Mila 2020. Pecker will continue to invest in Maidstone, and with your support, we are dedicated to delivering a high-quality flagship scheme
That's your
on
time,
this site.
sir, but thank you. I think you were just about to finish anyway. Right, draw members' attention to the fact that we do have a fairly substantial urgent update, so I hope that you will make sure you read that. Yes, one moment. And can I take any declarations of lobbying? I think we've probably all been lobbied. Anyone not been? Councillor Perry, have you been lobbied? I think he's indicated. That's everyone. That's everyone. It was very hard to tell because you were looking at your papers. Can I just ask people to be clear when they're indicating on that? Right, I think the only ward member here is Councillor Harwood, so I'm going to turn to you.
Thank you, Chairman. Though Rob Eves, one of the other councillors, he has submitted his thoughts on the application, I understand. Has somebody got them? Or?
I haven't. Has anyone else got them from the Conservative group?
Right, he might have meant that I was meant to do it then. But anyway, but I will just put some context. I think to many of you this will seem a mammoth and gargantuan building, but I think we need to understand the history of this site. That 20 years ago, this was Kent County Council's SHQ in terms of its office buildings and so on. In fact, I worked on the site for 10 years. The site was sold on to developers, was subsequently subcompartmentalised and sold off, which has led to some issues in terms of derelict sites and in terms of delivery of the infrastructure that the local residents were promised from the outset, and in really fundamentally in terms of viability because of the property speculation there's been on the land. The real issue that I want to put across is the journey that led us to the application on the papers in front of us. Effectively, we've had a generation of residents, literally a generation of residents, living amongst dereliction and partly demolished buildings, piles of bricks, asbestos hanging out, things. We've had antisocial behaviour in the buildings that have stayed remaining there, which have been profound and significant ever since. And put yourself in the place of residents who've lived in basically a demolition site for 20 years. And that's a backdrop that we must look against. In terms of the scheme that we see before us, and it's worth saying that the big tower, the one that you can see from across Maidstone, which is often quoted, does not enjoy planning permission. There is a planning permission on the site, but actually what is being built is not compliant. There is an extant planning application, and I look forward to the day that it comes to this committee, because there's a lot to be said about it, actually, in terms of the tenure, in terms of the materials and other really fundamental issues. However, in relation to this site, there was a public exhibition in St Faith's Hall where there are plans to replace it, and local residents, they were quite forthright in putting across their views and their concerns. They understood that it was a tight site, that it was going to have to kind of, you know, sing for its supper, but there were certain bottom lines that they wanted. And that was essentially to be completely different from the KCC outline scheme, which completely covered the site in a wall of development, lost all the trees, and just created a wall between the east and Radnor Close, Lee Heights, and the other development within. And that led to a number of changes to go for a more slender but tighter but smaller footprint building, which is what we've got. There was a lot of concern about sustainability. This scheme was converted so that it involves a lot of renewable generation, but also a lot of kind of passive house design principles. All of the TPO trees will be protected, so therefore that's the buffering and the landscape. And I think you need to look at a big building in the local context, in that we have the Medway Valley and we have the copse between Royal Engineers Road and Chatham Road of large lime trees and so on that's in there. So that landscaping is all important to absorb large buildings. So that was a fundamental that they wanted maintained. And all through that process, I think the applicants and I think the local residents thought that the planners were coming with them on that journey, and that we were getting towards a scheme that everybody could live with. Of course there are misgivings about parking issues and so on, but then again, if you can't have small flats just up the road from the main station, then where are we going to achieve developments that are not subordinate to the motor car? And I think in this case, because it's flatted development, because of its proximity to the station, because of its proximity to the best bus service in Maidstone, the north-south one from between Chatham and Maidstone, it's somewhere it can work. Through the negotiation, however, the car club issue came in, and you'll remember that on the site that did get permission, but which has not been built, the car club was pivotal in that, and it's a key part of this application. However, I think the key difference between this and the scheme which is towering above us is that the design here is much, much better. I know some officers have some concerns about tall buildings, but I think actually a tall, slender building can be more attractive and allow more landscaping to be maintained and actually fit within the landscape better. And there are some buildings I don't want to see from any distance, long distances or short. In fact, this building, I suggest, is not going to damage the streetscape or the landscape. And actually, with the trees and so on that are around it, I think it will provide, as was mentioned by the applicants, a gateway feature. And I think, frankly, having the two taller buildings actually balances the site. If we have the one 18-storey building projecting from this site, I think actually we're creating some height. And frankly, go back to the early 60s when the book tower went in, and it had height even then. And I think it can sustain it. So, with all of that said, I think it's worth adding that Councillor Eaves is in Manchester tonight, so could not be here. However, his view is largely the same, is that enough is enough for the residents having to live in a demolition site, not having their community facilities coming forward. This has been a design negotiated over not months but years to get what we as councillors and what local residents can live with. We haven't got everything, but we've got a lot more than we've got on any of the other plots, let's say, on this development, on this campus site. And therefore, I think that we're broadly supportive of moving that we actually do that we approve this scheme. Because there are no conditions here, essentially, we will need to give delegated powers to the officers to come up with the appropriate conditions, And as a safeguard for those appropriate conditions, I suggest that the ward councillors and the group spokespersons, where they are different, should have sight of those conditions. What I do not want is the scheme coming back to committee, because we've been here before on Springfield. We wanted a supermarket on Springfield. We thought we got it approved. It came back to committee, and somehow the decision we thought we made got overturned, and we had a derelict site for another 10 years. So we've had our fingers burnt on this, so I'm quite prepared to stick my neck out and ask that we get that grant of permission and that we enable the conditions in a way that we cannot get history being rewritten. And as you can tell, I am quite emotional about this. 20 years on this site, we've had problems. Here is a way to
I've let
overcome
you come
that.
back because the officer's introduction was quite long, but I think that's quite, that is enough. So you're moving a recommendation to approve, subject to some caveats. Is that seconded? Councillor Wilby, do you wish to speak now or later?
Yeah, I'd kind of like to reiterate a lot of stuff that Tony said. Obviously, I got quite lobbied about the Section 106 monies, and apparently there wasn't any, you know, they've come forward saying there is some. The actual scheme asks for a lot of the stuff that we ask for generally at every planning committee that doesn't actually come to us. It's got the PV, it's got the shared travel club. It's not a bad looking building, actually, to tell you the truth, I don't think, neither, especially compared to the huge white thing next to it, which you can see from every corner of Maidstone. I think this actually could work, and I think Councillor Harwood is right that we need to move with this, otherwise, potentially, we could have a lot worse development.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think if the committee are to overturn this recommendation, we need to be very, very clear of why we're doing it. I think it's a reason, it may well be a stance to take, but we have to be very, very clear why. One concern I have had is with the consistency of decision making. I think with planning applications it is important to try and reach consistent verdicts, and I have to say I have been struggling with the position on this one. However, having said that, there are arguments for saying that if this were to be approved, we would have to be very, very careful about how we do it, because what I would be concerned about is, making sure that we actually get what we are actually overturning it for. It wouldn't be the first time, but we've been in a situation where that wasn't delivered. I think of the Fairview Homes footbridge. Where is that? Which we approved in a planning application I don't know, 15 years ago, maybe, something like that now, which was supposed to go over the Medway. And of course, in due course, that was not delivered because, the viability assessment significantly changed. So I'm not saying we shouldn't approve it, Councillor Harwood, and I have every sympathy for the residents, but I think we need to be as sure as possible that if we do that, that it's as robust a decision as possible in that it can be, and B, that why we're doing it is very clearly outlined. Final question, and this is to an officer. I believe the applicant's agent made some reference to being open to a landscaping addition. Presumably that would be in addition to the TPO trees. I'm struggling slightly with how that could be accommodated unless it would be by a reduction in the car parking. Can I have clarification as to what officers think might not be possible on that front? Because my main reservation with this is the boundary between the two sites.
Chair, I've taken you back to the site plan. You can see on the western boundary and the southern the retained TPO trees. Below those trees there is inevitably an area of open space. Right. I think officers would suggest that that is space that really provides no more than setting for the development. It isn't space that residents could or would want to necessarily use as daily amenity space. It has the impact of the roundabout.
I wasn't asking about amenity space, I was asking about additional landscaping, whether it's possible to soften that edge between the two sites. It's a fundamentally different issue.
Not without losing access and car parking arrangements. I think this is one of the issues with a high density scheme. The competing challenges all conflict with each other. So if you try to address one issue, you create a bigger problem with another deficit.
Yeah, I just wanted to be clear on that particular.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm afraid I'm going to have to go over a number of points.
Could you make sure you speak into the microphone?
I'm afraid I'm going to have to make a number of points because, as you said yourself, it's so important for this committee to make consistent decisions based on our own local plan. So, first of all, if we go back to the tower block under construction, which was a U&I scheme, now Western Homes. It's very similar in a lot of respects, in that councillors chose not to insist on planning obligations for 30% affordable housing on site. That's what the policy said. Not the usual amounts for education, etc., based on viability. And indeed, today, yet again, the applicants here are saying, we can't provide any affordable housing on site. I realise there's the £250,000 for the community centre, which seems to be weighed very highly. But again, in terms of the local plan hierarchy of planning obligations, affordable housing is much higher. In terms of this money for community facilities, that is the same position as has been the case on previous permissions. We've got the money, and in fact, I had a meeting, which Councillor Harwood attended, with somebody who had a scheme for spending some of that money. So the money isn't the problem. If members also cast their mind back to the Red Row application that got permitted, Red Row, rightly or wrongly, were offering space for a community facility. And we had this whole debate about, we've got money, but where's it going to go to? And who's going to operate this community use? What exactly is this community use? Is it going to be run by KCC? Is it going to be run by the NHS? I don't know. Is it in the draft Section 106 agreement?
There is a financial sum. Sorry. Within the 106, there's a financial sum, but not a facility.
Okay. So this is an important point. If we know where it's going to go, presumably there's a provider then.
Yes.
And
if I can just make this simple, right, the problem, we'll come back to the money issue, but there is no problem about identifying the facility. We know where that is. It is at St Faith's Church of England Community Centre. And the expanded site, because it is a bigger site now, because the house behind it, and for want of a better term, the provider would be a fairly substantial institution called the Church of England, which I don't think is going to disappear anytime soon. In that sense, I mean, there are a lot of other issues, but that is not an issue. That would be very easily. Obviously, Councillor Harwood has not mentioned, and he would need to mention this, that the delegation would be not just on the conditions, but would have to be on the heads of terms of the Section 106 agreement as well. And I think you probably meant to include that in your motion, but if not, please amend it accordingly.
Okay, so that facility will be provided by the Church of England at sometime in the future. Okay, in terms of housing, this is an unallocated site. Obviously, we don't just as the speaker said, we don't just look at the need to provide X amount of housing. We look at the type of housing. So to be blunt about it, I see lots of office blocks being converted into apartments, so I don't think there's actually a shortage of apartments. In fact, I see some being constructed now. What this will not do is relieve pressure for site allocations in the new local plan for family housing. In fact, the need to cater for family housing is specified in the NPPF. So it's not a crude argument about we need X numbers, it's the type of housing as well. In terms of a slender building, if we could go back, I don't understand how this could be classed as a slender building. In fact, we're not saying it's so much the height, we're talking about the mass. We're saying it's far too bulky a building. Over the years, Historic England, Kay before them, have come up with lots of guidance on, for want of a better term, tall buildings. Why? Because tall or big buildings, by their very nature, are going to stand out. They're going to be incongruous. So getting into a platitude like a landmark building or a gateway building, you've got to think, well, it's clearly out of context by its very size. So first question, is it sited in the right place? I've dealt with tall buildings along the riverside. I think they're acceptable. Why? Because the actual River Medway is the lowest point in the valley. So the valley sides help screen a lot of the tall buildings. As Austin pointed out, to me, one of the key characteristics of the context of Maidstone is the skyline. You can see the skyline of the North Downs from virtually all of Maidstone. This totally punctuates it. You can see it from the western side of the River Medway. If you go down Queen's Road, which I have, you see the western tower being built. You would see this to the left-hand side. Austin's taken a picture from the north. I often travel down the A229. At the moment, you can see the Western Homes development punctuating that skyline. This would just double the impact of it. So it's not just a matter of just saying, oh, tall building, must be acceptable. It's got to be in the right place. Secondly, you know, there are some tall buildings, as we all know, which have been approved in London. To my mind, and I've got a background in urban design, some of those buildings, such as Swiss Re, it's at the time of construction, they probably had the best sustainable credentials in the entire world. Some of the quality of the architecture is fantastic, and it should be of a very, very high standard. If you're going to approve another building, which will be the second highest building in Maidstone, I would have thought you'd want to improve the quality than what's in front of you tonight. I'm passionate about improving quality, not just accepting things because they fall under the banner of a tall building. And lastly, I think absolutely quite right at the planning committee back in the day with it was actually a Bouygues application, an outline application. An illustrative plan was submitted with the application, and I dealt with that application. Planning committee had a concern about that illustrative plan, so the illustrative plan became more and more detailed. And one of the things it did was it protected the TPO'd trees. This does protect more trees, per se, but the original scheme, which to my mind was far more acceptable in terms of its bulk, but hey, there's a big difference between 170 units and 114. So the scheme that was approved in terms of the illustrative scheme with the outline planning permission, it was carefully considered. Thank you.
Yes. Councillor.
Thank you, Chair. I sat at this committee for the Western Homes Tower, and I was horrified. I was sitting as a substitute member that evening, and so I kind of just bounded up, hadn't really looked at the papers that much, and I was absolutely astounded at the scale of the building. It's not just a tall building for Maidstone, the Western Homes Tower, and this one isn't far off it. The Western Homes Tower is the tallest building in Kent, and it actually dwarfs many of the riverside structures that are in London. This is not a structure that should be gracing the banks of the historic River Medway. We have a local plan. There's not enough in there, in my view, about design, but there is some things in there about design, and development in the town centre should demonstrate a quality of design that responds positively to the townscape. This does not, and it should respond positively to the river's setting, as seen in both short-range views and in longer-range views. Page 39 of our local plan. This would dominate the skyline. It's a concrete, the primary material is concrete. It's a concrete tower block. Just because we can approve it doesn't mean we should. People that live around Maidstone complain so many times of the development around the river and the lack of design criteria that have been applied to previous development around it. And yet we're sitting here and just because we can, and I'm sympathetic to local councillors wants to get something built there, but hand on heart, when this is around for the next 40, 50, 60 years, are you going to sit here and say, yes, I approved a concrete tower block because I thought that was the right building for our historic town? I don't think so. It's very rare, to be fair to officers, it's incredibly rare that they actually balance their arguments in favour of design. They are so conscientious in terms of wanting to deliver housing, being so aware of our targets. So for the senior planning officers, you know, that we pay and have to, and respect greatly, to turn around and say, do you know what, on balance, we just don't feel this is the right scheme. It's very, very rare that they do this. So, so yes, I mean, I'm minded to refuse on the arguments that I've heard so far.
Councillor Round.
Thank you, Chair. Some of the issues I was going to raise have already been brought up, but I'll extend it further and say that I'm going to use some fairly emotive words here. I believe the town is being sold cheap. Really cheap. Or alternatively, developers in my rural ward have been ripped off. Because quite frankly, there are at least 2 developments in my ward that are paid per house or per apartment considerably more than this amount of money, where they have not measured against 10% affordable. They've been measured against a lot more than that. And they've had to pay up accordingly. And as a result of that, we're still finished up with some lovely designed houses in my ward. So I do think that this is just a token gesture, and quite frankly, it's not good enough. But then, as has been alluded to by the Chief Planning Officer, we've got loads of Section 106s for this area, absolutely loads of them. We just haven't spent them. Those issues are quite astounding to me. Plus, I'd like to know really what the viability is, because it doesn't stack up to me. And then next thing, I think we need to be consistent. And at the end of the day, I actually do like high-rises, as long as they're iconic, innovative, well-engineered and well-designed. I don't actually think this is. And as well as that, whilst we don't have the right policies, we have a good enough policy to suggest, as Councillor Bright suggested, that we don't need to build such a building here. So on the basis of a variety of factors, I'm certainly minded that I would not like to see it, but I no reason why it can't come back and be better. There's no reason why we can't have an alternative, but it has to be considerably better than this, and I don't believe the town should be sold cheap.
Councillor Mumford.
Right, just so you know exactly where I'm coming from, I'd like to compliment the developer in saving more trees and renewable energy. The amenity space is appalling, in my mind. And I look at policy SP20, where in this area we're looking for 30%. Okay, the allocated sites are 20%. And we have choices. They can supply that off-site, which they haven't taken the opportunity to do so. They can identify it off-site, but they give us the cash for 10%. So in effect, we've lost another 20% of our affordable housing target, and they're not even going to do the work to find it for us. I'm not opposed to high-rise. I think possibly if you're going to put one high-rise up, why not put two? But I'd like to see a certain amount of synergy. And what I see here is something, Western Homes is quite modern in looking, and what I see there is 2-3 blocks that could have been built in the 60s. I'm not educated, I've got 2 eyes, and that's what I see. I'm not happy that we time and again keep losing our affordable housing. That's where I am.
Anyone else wish to indicate? No, I'll bring you back later. I'm taking people who haven't spoken before. Councillor Atkinson.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm quite surprised that in the report there's no mention of policy H111, which specifically refers to this site. I mean, it says here the highest density development should be situated on northeastern and southeastern parts of the site. Well, doesn't seem to be the case.
This isn't an allocated site, so I don't think there can be a policy reference to that.
All right, well, can I? Right, fair enough. But I was going on to say I do agree with the recommendation, but it's a bit unclear here. At the end of refusal 1, the 4th line up, it says, and proposes the ground floor is not considered to be appropriately active. I'm not quite sure what that means. It doesn't actually make sense. So as this is a legal document, effectively, I think that needs to be clarified. So, but otherwise I support the recommendation.
We'll come back to that if we're moving to it. I just wanted to add a couple of things. I think we need to be clear what we are and aren't saying. I don't think the fact that this is an unallocated site is that significant because it has a consent. Well, it had a consent for housing and it's likely to go for housing. So, however, the fact that a site has a consent for housing doesn't necessarily mean that correctly that you put any type of housing on it. Having said that, I do think that sometimes there is a case for saying, that affordable housing, despite being the policy that we put forward as the first, is not the most important criterion. However, in those circumstances, one does rather expect to see that design quality, for example, is a very high priority as an offsetter to that, or that additional community facilities or whatever are provided instead. So it's a sort of balancing equation. Having said that, I do like when they're appropriate tall buildings. I don't have a problem with that. I did vote for the Western Homes building. I have no particular issue with that. Doesn't mean I like all tall buildings or all short buildings or all broad buildings. So you have to, buildings have quality as positive and negative, which are different than their height. And I think that if we are, for example, not having the relevant quota of affordable housing, then obviously the design quality has to actually significantly be much higher to offset that, or other benefits apply. Members need to make up in their own mind, weigh that issue. I have to say though that if we are not going forward with this, I will be coming to you tomorrow, Mr. Jarman, and asking you for a plan, an actual delivery plan for the community facilities at Ringliston. If we're saying we've got the money, I will be coming to you tomorrow and asking you to set that out, a delivery plan, because frankly, you know, you're asking us to set aside the community issue on the basis that the funding is available, and it has just been the question of identifying the site and the facility. So I will be coming to you as a councillor tomorrow asking you to set out that issue separately, because I'm going to take you at your word that that is the case, because you've told us so. So, you know, and so because I think that it is important as a consideration for us to weigh as members whether or not the community facility, I'm not saying it's the only argument, but it is an important argument whether or not the community facilities would be reliant on this and further future applications. And you can come back now because I've now finished.
Okay, a general point, but an important point I should have stated earlier, is that in the revised NPPF of February of this year, there's a specific paragraph, paragraph 57, on viability. And I think we'd all agree that the proposal, a large amount of it derives from this viability argument. But the revised NPPF is very clear on viability assessments. I quote, "The weight to be given to a viability assessment is a matter for the decision maker," i.e. you, "having regard to all the circumstances in the case, including whether the plan and the viability evidence underpinning it is up to date." Well, obviously, we have an up-to-date local plan, which, you know, we fought hard to get through. So to my mind, the viability argument, it cannot be weighed as heavily as probably the U&I one that was before you, before the revised NPPF came out. And secondly, on a much more specific matter, and thank you, Chairman, for raising this again, if Austin could read out exactly what is proposed by the applicant on this community facility, because like you said, that seems to be weighed very, very high.
Yes, Chair. I mean, just to be clear, there has been no discussion with officers, between officers and the applicant, or officers and members regarding where this financial contribution for community facilities would go. Originally, the planning application included 420 square feet of community space within the building. I think it was agreed by all that that wouldn't suit the needs of a community group. But the only proposal that has been put to the planning authority reads as follows: a financial contribution of £250,000 payable to Maidstone Borough Council for an off-site contribution towards community facility provision in lieu of the requirement to deliver on-site. It doesn't specify a particular facility.
With respect to the officers, that wasn't at all the point I was raising. The question was that you specifically said, Mr. Jarman, that the money separate from this application for the community facility was available. You said that.
So, yes, there's other Section 106 monies, yes.
So I'm simply saying that it is important that that be on the record, and if a determination goes a certain way, I will be coming to you tomorrow to actually say that we need to set out a delivery plan for that. Anyway, Councillor Perry.
Thank you, Chairman. I will listen to the discussion. Well, let me come straight away to this. I support the recommendation of the officer, and I very much support what Rob Jarman said in his first statement. I think he hit the nail really on the head. Quite frankly, I think it was Councillor Harwood said we should stick our necks out on this. Well, I'm not prepared to stick my neck out on something, actually, which I personally don't like. I think it's I don't like the design at all. I think it's in the wrong place, actually. And interestingly, when I first saw it, I thought, yeah, that might work in London, but I don't think it works in Maidstone. And I think we've got too obsessed with this. And I think that the lack of car parking spaces, I know it meets the wonderful modal shift, but I think it's a disaster, quite frankly, and we're just going to create a problem for ourselves. I think with the lack of affordable housing is another major issue. But the thing that really gets me in this is on pages 47 and 48, there's a whole raft of reasons why we should refuse, all based on our local plan, which some of us sitting around this table spent many, many hours discussing. And I think we should support our local plan, quite frankly. There's a whole raft of items here. And I'm really quite flabbergasted that we've drifted on with this debate, because I think the design, I know they tried to improve the design, but quite frankly, it's still, I won't say what I think, but put it this way, I think it's still doesn't meet up to my standards of what I want to see on the River Medway. I think our river side has suffered over the years, I have to say, by a lot of rather strange decisions, I think. And I think we now, I just don't want to add to this. And certainly I think, looking to the future, and I think Councillor Price said it very well, that in 30 or 40 years' time, some of us may not be around, but those who are will think, do they want to be a party to this? So I'll leave it there, but I can tell you straight away that I support the officer's recommendation to refuse.
As time is pressing, can I ask members not, including on both sides of this discussion, not to just repeat? Any new comments? Councillor?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. It's nice to be back here for however short a time. We've heard people refer to the fact that the materials are basic. Please, could you put up the materials back onto there? Are any of them just externally faced of concrete?
Chair. As I mentioned in the presentation, there are a series of a palette of materials for the building, and I was going to come back on Councillor Bryce. It may be a concrete frame structure, but there is very little exposed concrete in this building. Most of the materials, the cladding and the brickwork cover the concrete frame behind, so I think it would be unfair to call it a concrete frame tower. There are features of polished stone and other elements that feature within some elements of the scheme, but in the main, the frame is clad by brick and other materials.
Thank you. I just wanted that clarified. Two, we've heard from Mr. Jarman as head of our planning that he doesn't think that this building should proceed because it doesn't give us good enough design qualifications by its design. And he doesn't think that it's necessarily slender. I would have hoped that he would have spoken to the officer who's presenting and has looked at all of this during the application process. I would hope to have had a finger on the pulse and seen what was coming through, and that perhaps during the talks with the developers, this would have been strongly put. And if that is one of my questions, was it strongly put that the design was incorrect? We've also heard about people challenging viability. Sometimes we've had yellow pages about viability because we've questioned them and we've looked. We've heard that there's an awful lot of sill coming in here, which is providing schooling, it's providing doctors' surgeries, libraries, and contributions to all of that. So there is contribution. The affordability off-site of homes, I agree, 10% is low. The ability to build off-site, I'm glad we are allowing to come through the whole process, because I think there are ways that we can improve our own housing supply of affordable, truly affordable homes in this way. But what I would like to know, we've spoken also, or we've had questions about the 106 that's available in this area for the community. Now, I don't think it's a problem to speak about how much it is. So I would like to know, we've heard that I think the community centre is maybe 1.5 million to build. Now, we just got to do a simple back of the cigarette packet add up how much money there is. Because if there isn't enough money in the contributions of 106 that exist now, plus what the Church of England, acting on behalf of the community who will run it, are there to put forward, if there is a massive gap, then we still will have, one, an undeveloped site here. Two, we will have no facility being brought to the community, which is quite isolated by the dual carriageway that we have between the Royal Engineers site. The footbridge brings people over. But I think this is something this community needs. So I find myself in a problem, because I agree, if our head of planning is saying the design should have been tightened up, we deserve more. I agree with council around. But I would have hoped the officer would have been saying to the developer, this isn't right. You must tweak this now. We expect better in Maidstone. It shouldn't be coming here. So my questions are, and I hope you've noted them, but I'd like to know whether we do know that viability exists. Because if we ask for as many different 106 and SIL, if it's not going to come in 5 years' time, then that is not what we want to approve.
On your first point, the officers did engage with the applicant quite consistent, yeah, and so that point was made. What I think we do need to know is what monies are available in Section 106, but we did have at some point, but what we did have from the officer was his personal assurance that he felt the money was there, and I'm going to take him at his word for the community centre. On the viability issue, if we were going to approve this tonight, we would have to actually do some further work on this, because viability assessments are no longer supposed to be Part 2 and in private. They are actually now publicly available documents. And my understanding is that for some reason, that has not occurred with this viability assessment. So if we were going to overturn tonight, I would actually have to ask members, I would actually have to ask you to defer that for a cycle, and so that could be placed on the website for the public to see. Now, if we're going to do that, I'm not going to have any further discussion, frankly, because and during that time, and I'm sorry after so much discussion to say this, but if we're going to have to do that anyway, if we're going to approve, we could at that time also have a table setting out what contributions for the community facility exist and what don't. And I would really appreciate that, because I think, look, I'm not saying that would lead to an approval. I'm just saying it is a significant piece of information I don't have. So I would like not to continue this discussion and defer for those 2 points.
Sorry, Mr. Chalmers indicating, trying to get back to us. It may be something you can add.
Sorry, just to respond to the various points Councillor Cox made. Yes, a choice was put to the applicant.
Can you address that deferral point, because I'm not having any further debate if we are going to defer that information. Yeah, because I'm not minded to vote either way. I want to know. I would personally like that viability report on the website and advertised so people can, including councillors, can read it in full. I would like to know what contributions for the community facility are available. And I'm not saying that will determine how I vote, but those are 2 pieces of significant information I don't have. And procedurally, I feel uncomfortable determining this, not knowing either of those. And I'm not minded unless you have an objection. I want to defer for those 2 reasons. Any speeches for or against deferral, and that's that. I'm not taking anything else.
Sorry, Chair. I think Mr Jarman just wants to come back on your deferral point, if that's okay.
Yeah. If members wanted to refuse the application, I'm not suggesting they are going to, but that wouldn't mean a deferral in my view.
Except I don't know what the community facility sums are available, and I want to know that as well.
Okay. If I could just answer, because it does overlap with viability, some of the questions stroke points that Councillor Cox raised. SIL, there's no discretion with SIL. SIL's a tax, a community infrastructure levy, so it's not some kind of bonus that we get in SIL. You have to pay it. Rightly or wrongly, but again, it goes back to consistency of decision making based on the local plan. Our local plan policy clearly says the on-site provision of affordable housing. So by far that's the most important consideration. But
I'm sorry. I specifically asked for a discussion on whether members wish to defer that for those two pieces of work to take place. I'm not going to entertain either officers or members speaking in favour of the application or refusing it at this point. Right? Is that clear? Right. Speech is on whether to defer or not. Councillor Harwood. And
I would support deferral for that so many issues are tied up with the viability of this site. And I would ask, can the case officer put the shot of the existing site with the book tower, of the derelict book tower? Yeah, well, one of those would do. I mean, you know, that was probably the derelict one with the back full in it, but this is what residents are having to live with. And what we need, we need is to understand the issues underpinning this and the viability.
I stopped Mr Jarman, so I'm stopping you. I'm not taking speeches for it either. On the Councillor Mumford, on deferral.
Yeah, it's just checking on the deferral. Many times we defer on 2 or 3 issues and then it's brought back to us and the only 2 or 3 issues we're allowed to discuss are those 2 or 3 issues. I just want it confirmed that the whole application comes back and we debate the whole application.
It's just so much has been rotated around the viability. I think we need...
Okay, the only other thing I was going to ask, from what Officer Jarman said about changing the design to more slimmer build, I'd like to ask the officers to actually try to work with the developer to get a better design. Well, obviously with the developers being here tonight, maybe listening to that, they may change their mind. We know that's happened in the past, but it's just something that can be asked for.
I'm sure the officers will talk to them while it's deferred and they've heard what's being said. Right. Councillor Bartlett.
We've just spent about an hour discussing this, and now we're saying defer it. What is the point? Why can't we just go to a vote now and decide now?
If my mind... Right,
but
because...
we do know the facts, it's all there.
Right, Councillor Bartlett, if that is defeated, that's exactly what will happen. Now, Councillor Round.
I just wanted to say that I would be happy to make the formal proposal to defer.
Thank you, seconded. And I'm going to take a vote on that. Everyone's clear on the 2 reasons. Those in favour of deferral for those 2 reasons. Those against? And what was the vote on that? 7 for deferral, 6 against. That is deferred for those 2 reasons, but we will be discussing the full application. You need to get the viability survey on the website. So,
It'll take time.
Well, I don't care. It takes time. Yeah. Oh, sorry. That. No, it wasn't. Was it? Oh, yeah. Yeah. Sorry. That. I'm sorry. You're quite correct. And the original motion had been moved, so that's an amendment, so we need to take that as a substantive motion. Sorry. Those in favour of deferral, please. Those against? Right, thank you very much. Right, there will be a 5-minute comfort break for anyone who needs it. Ladies and gentlemen, are we all more or less back together again? If not, if you're not here, well, I'm going on anyway. Right. I'm sorry about having to defer that last one, but sometimes you just have to do these things. Right, item 20, page 120, is the next item, which hopefully we will determine. So I turn to the officer to introduce this Great Fowl Hall farmhouse at Wood, which is in Maidstone Borough.
Thank you, Chair. So the proposal at Great Fowl Farmhouse is in relation to a site to the west of the main dwelling. Oh, sorry.
We're having a little trouble here.
Yeah. And the application seeks permission for the conversion of an existing garage and replacement, extension and demolition of the existing lean-to and carport. So as you can see, this is the site plan. The actual site is here, and it is west of Dorman Lane. It's accessed through a narrow track which serves residential and agricultural buildings, including the Oast House and various other buildings, as you can see around here. And the next one, you can see it a little bit clearer of the accumulation of buildings that surround the site, and to the rear of the site is agricultural land, sorry. So this is the existing building as it stands. The carport at the front here is to be demolished, and the lean-to is also to be demolished. So this is a closer picture of the actual building that is going to be converted. As you can see, it's quite a robust building that would be capable of conversion. The roof will be replaced with tiles matching the main dwelling, and the eaves raised to accommodate the raised ground floor levels, as the site is in a flood risk 2 and 3 zone. So this is showing the existing building in relation to the main dwelling, the farmhouse. The farmhouse itself is listed, and therefore the adaptations are not feasible for the applicant's needs. And as the access is the same for both the proposed annex and the main dwelling, and I consider, as you can see the location of the annex, it would be seen as it's in the rear garden of the main dwelling. So this is the existing plans and elevation showing the existing lean-to, carport, and the floor plans, and the proposed layout. As you can see, compared to the existing plans, there's not a considerable amount of change in terms of the form and appearance of the actual building. So the rooms, in terms of the rooms, one bedroom will be used for the applicant's elderly parent, and the other a full-time carer. I would consider the replacement extension and the changes to the roof to enhance the character and appearance of the building, and would be sympathetic to the listed farmhouse and the surrounding buildings. In terms of justification for the conversion, a supporting letter has been provided by a doctor which contains compelling reasons surrounding the need for the conversion, which include health issues. And as I previously mentioned, the listed building is not feasible for the adaptation. In regards to the flood risk, the design of the annex has complied with the standard advice from the Environment Agency in terms of raising its ground levels 840 mil and the materials used. The site is also located in a flood warning service area, and it is in close proximity to the main dwelling if the occupier would have to egress quickly. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Our first speaker on this application is well known to us, it's Councillor Brown, Yalding Parish Council.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and forgive me for doing the impersonation of Rudolph this evening. Yalding Parish Council is concerned at the Office's interpretation of the MPPF planning and flood risk, paragraph 163, section E, which states that it must be demonstrated that safe access and escape routes are included where appropriate as part of an agreed emergency plan. The officer in her report deems there to be safe routes to and from the proposed annex, as the main house is only some 27 metres away, where she says it will be possible to seek refuge on the upper levels of the farmhouse or the wider site if needed. It is our understanding, as discussed with the Environment Agency, that these safe routes mean being able to move in and out of the area without needing to travel through floodwater. These safe routes should also be available for emergency vehicles, such as an ambulance, to attend the property if needed, without the emergency workers risking their own safety by travelling through floodwater. It is essential for a vulnerable person. It is not advised that anyone should seek shelter on upper floors of dwellings if there is no route out beyond the flooded area. The Christmas Day flood of 2013 lasted for several days, and emergency workers were needed to rescue residents who had taken shelter on the upper floor of their homes, not knowing how long that flood would last or that the power would be lost for 4 days. We do not believe that the proposal satisfies the requirement for safe access and escape routes. However, if members have a mind to approve, a much more robust emergency plan is required than moving to an adjacent property that is also at risk of flooding. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Brown. Councillor McLaughlin, please.
Evening, members. This application really should be an open and shut case, as recommended by the planning officer, but has been brought to the committee by the parish council because of their concerns about access to and egress from the proposed annex in the event of a flood. Now, Yalding has every right to be cautious about the effects of flooding from their own bitter experience in the village. And if this was a new build property in the countryside and in a floodplain, they would be right to object. However, on this occasion, I believe they're being overcautious given the nature of this development. This is not a standalone new build of property. It's quite clearly ancillary to the main farmhouse, and all services such as electricity, water, sewerage, etc., will be supplied via the farmhouse. The annex should therefore be considered as such, and the risk from flooding is no greater than that already existing for residents in the farmhouse. Should there be a flood, the appropriate resistance and resilience measures have been incorporated into the design so as not to increase the risk of flooding elsewhere. In addition, should there be a flood, and I'm told that even in the bad floods in Yalding in 2013, this area did not flood, the proximity of the farmhouse does offer a readily accessible place of refuge across a concrete farm yard area. Significantly, the Conservation Officer has stated that the works have the potential to enhance the appearance of the building, and there have been no objections from the immediate neighbours. Indeed, they've stated that this will enhance the area around the farmhouse and make good use of a redundant and untidy building. Although not specifically a planning issue, there is a real reason for wanting to create this annex in order to provide live-in care for a close elderly relative. And I'd refer you to paragraph 6.35 to 6.38, which provides all the justification required, in my view, for granting permission for this application. You'll see that this is not an opportunistic application for an Airbnb facility, but a worthy development
which avoids the need to consign a parent to a distant care home. It should be applauded as such. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. I don't think there are any urgent updates, so can I take any declarations of lobbying? Any lobbying? Councillor Bryce, anyone else? No. Okay. Don't think there are any Marden and Yalding members here apart from Councillor McLaughlin. So is anyone indicate? Councillor Harwood.
Thank you, Chairman. I really do take on board the points raised by the Parish Council in terms of the flood vulnerability and flood risk, and we do need to be seen to ensure optimum safety of this site. What I would like to understand is whether there will be the ability for the Environment Agency's flood alert service to get into this property, because having responded personally to flooding in the Yalding and Collier Street area as part of the day job, I know how quickly it comes, and I know how it can be very difficult moving between buildings and two buildings, and how dangerous floodwater is, particularly at night. And that's why, as Mrs. Brown referenced, we had to undertake a number of rescues by night in fast-flowing water. So it is not a kind of an academic issue. If I can be reassured that there is a telephone system or a mobile system, there is some way that we can get the EA flood alert in there, and that this development is on the EA's list for alert, I think I would be happy that we've taken the safeguard in terms of emergency planning that the policy seeks. On another slightly more mundane point, this building seems to comply almost precisely with the updated MPPG 2019 in ensuring that you do build in niches for wildlife and so on. I mean, it looks like, there's probably bats and things in it anyway, but there should be bat tubes and so on. The MPPG 2019 states very strongly, and I know this is like a stuck record, but every time we get an application coming to this committee, it's down to members getting that condition put on, when the MPPG not just supports, but strongly supports the installation of such measures. So, with some sort of a safeguard around the EA flood alert system, and with the integral niche for wildlife, I'm willing to move that we do grant permission as per the papers and the update. Thank you.
Do you wish to speak to that, Councillor Cox, or honourable say?
So those, what Councillor Harwood has just said, will become recommendations, not just
yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm personally, given that they could do most of these things without the benefit of even applying for planning permission, I think it's probably best to grant with the additional amendments to the recommendation, because, to be honest, a lot of what could be done without doing that, but without the additional safeguard of amending the recommendations. It's probably best to do it that way. Did you wish to add any?
Just briefly, Chair, I think from a planning perspective, the application has been the subject of a detailed flood risk assessment, which is quite unusual for a small scheme. I don't think officers would advise that a condition requiring those measures is necessary to make the development acceptable in planning terms, but we could easily put an informative on advising the applicant of our desire to see those measures. My suspicion is that because of the nature of the accommodation, there's going to be an awful lot of care and connection between the main dwelling and this anyway. But we'd be happy to put an informative on. I don't think a condition is necessary, but it'll be your decision.
I'll come back to that in a second. I've got to take Councillor Mumford because he was drawing my attention to himself.
Yeah, I think this question needed to be asked before we made a proposal. If we got a highways problem, highways comment on it. I don't think it should be down to us to comment on whether we're putting people in danger. We should have consultation with the Environmental Agency. And if they wrote down here, we are happy with this application, then I can vote for it. But you're asking me now to take two old people's well-being and make a vote on it. This should have gone to the Environmental Agency to comment on. I know you think it complies to their regulations, but wouldn't it be nice if I could read here from the consultation of the Environmental Agency that it was acceptable? And yes, we would like it as a condition, then at least it gets done.
The standard advice was applied. They don't generally respond to schemes of this scale. But did you want to add anything to that, Councillor?
I think you may actually find that the responsibility for water in this area is not the Environment Agency, it's actually the Medway Internal Drainage Board.
The same argument would apply, I think, but I think we should add Councillor Harwood, in terms of your amendment to the recommendation. Councillor Harwood, do you?
I mean, my view is that I would not be happy with the informative. I think a condition is required, because knowing how flashy and how quickly floodwater comes up in this area in the middle of the night, I think its proximity to another dwelling house is not sufficient, and I believe that there should be a remote way of contacting that address and saying that the floodwater's coming. If people are on holiday or whatever, you know, all sorts of issues could come in, and I don't want to risk it.
Councillor Harwood, I don't think there's going to be a problem with putting that in. I find it very unlikely in the circumstances that the applicant would appeal for that being an unreasonable condition. I really think we should I don't think we're taking a big risk by including that. Anyone object to want to speak against that? In that case, I'm going to proceed to a vote on the amended recommendation, because I think we're all pretty much in agreement. Everyone clear on what it is? Okay, good. Those in favour of the amended recommendation? That's everyone. Thank you very much. Good. Move on to item 15 on page 61. Corylus Cottage, 165 Heath Road, Coxey. Right, a bit of a reshuffle. Are you ready? Excellent.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is an application for a part two-storey, part single-storey rear extension, a single-storey side extension, and a wooden framework at the front, sort of like a pergola type thing, to a dwelling in Cox Heath Village. It's important to note that the application is a resubmission. There was a previous application for a two-storey rear extension that was refused, and the applicant subsequently had pre-application discussions, and the application before members tonight is the outcome of those discussions. There were two reasons for refusal of the previous application. One related to the size and design of the previous extension and the harm that would have caused to the appearance of the house and the street scene. The second reason for refusal related to the impact on the outlook of the neighbouring bedroom window. The scheme before members, as you'll see in a minute, has been reduced in terms of its size and the design amended to address the reason for refusal relating to the harm to the street scene. And in terms of the impact on outlook, the first floor has been pulled back 1 metre from the common boundary and reduced in depth as well by 1 metre, and the roof has been hipped. So this is the application property as it stands. This is the view from Heath Road, showing it in relation to the neighbouring house to the east. You can see there's a hedge there in between and the space between the buildings. This is the view from Heath Road approaching from the east. That's from the direction of the Linton Crossroads. So this is the application building here. You can see the hedge again in between and the new house that's been built this side. So there's not that much view when you're coming along. You can't see too much the rear. This is the view looking from the other direction, as if you were going towards Linton from East Farley. This is the street scene, so that's the application building there. And this is the neighbouring house. And you can see that's also had some extensions added to it. This then, the block plan shows roughly the footprint of the proposed extensions before members tonight. This is the existing floor plans. And there is an existing rear extension, a single-storey rear extension. And that would be demolished to make way for the proposal. This is the proposed plans. So on the ground floor, the extension would project approximately 1.3 metres further than the existing single-storey rear extension, and it would run across the back of the property there. On the first floor, you can see that's the set-in, 1 metre from the boundary. The attached property is here. That's the degree of set-in, and it protrudes about 4 metres in that direction. This is the existing elevations. This is the back view with the existing single-storey rear extension, and the neighbour's bedroom window is about here. And then this is the proposed elevations. So if you can just see in the highlighted outline there, that's the rough extent of the rear extension. This is the side extension and the porch framework at the front there. And this is the back of the property. This is that's the neighbouring bedroom window that was connected to the second reason for refusal of the previous scheme. And that's it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Talk about architectural gems. Right, the first speaker on this application is Mrs. Spalding. Mrs. Spalding.
Good evening. I'm objecting to this planning application. This is a semi-detached Victorian cottage built in 1890, which I've lived in for 23 years. The planning application is for a front, side and rear extension. It's the rear extension that directly affects me. These are the reasons I would like the planning application refused. Loss of light, sunshine, building on the party wall, loss of amenities and overlooked. The planning application has not reduced impact significantly to the application number of 18/502887, which was refused by the Borough Council. Bullet points. Loss of light, extension is to the east side of my property. Will put my bedroom, bathroom, dining room and 2 Velux windows in shade, preventing sunlight to the property until the sun rises over the extension at midday. This affects not just one room, but 3, casting shadow over the outside decked area leading from my dining room. The windows have been there for 23 years plus. The house was built in 1890, and because I've lived there for over 20 years, this affects my right to right, which becomes a legal issue. Material planning permissions, these are deemed by government to be loss of light, sunlight, overlooking, loss of privacy, overshadowing, and loss of outlook. Maidstone Borough Council should be supporting natural light and not the excessive use of electricity. Building on the party wall. I do not at this stage give consent to building on the party wall. My quality of life will be affected by this large sprawling proposal. This is not a creation of a quality design and takes away the originality of the 1890s cottage. I refer back to the original planning application. The proposed two-storey extension, by reason of its scale, height, design and degree of rear wood projection, would appear as an over-large, bland and incongruous addition that would be poorly related to the form of the existing house and would result in the development that would appear excessive and sprawling in scale. As such, it would be determined to the visual appearance of the host building, the semi-detached pair which forms one half of which I live in. Overlooked, the upstairs extension will directly look into my decked area where we eat and entertain, plus a view into my Velux windows in the dining room single-storey roof. The upstairs extension is a metre away from my boundary. Looking out the bedroom window, all I will see is a wall. Whilst I recognise this has been stepped back marginally, I feel paragraph 2 of the planning decision of 510 still stands, which is that the proposed two-storey extension, by reason of its height, depth and proximity to the boundary with 163 Heath Road, my house, would be unacceptably overbearing on the neighbouring bedroom window, resulting in a significant loss of outlook for users of that room, which is me. To permit the proposal would therefore be contrary to policies DM1 and DM9 of the Maidstone Borough Local Plan of 2017. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Spalding. Councillor Webb.
Thank you, Chairman. Good evening, members. Firstly, I note on the planning portal on the 12th of August there was correspondence regarding the pre-commencement condition relating to archaeological issues, and these need to be considered deeply before perhaps significant artefacts are missed if there is to be a planning approval. Secondly, the Parish Council, in considering its response, has shown concern over the size of the extension and the impact this will have on the neighbouring property, and also the use of a party wall for part of that extension. Although the plans have been altered from the previous application, 18502-887, which was refused on the two grounds, the applicant has taken these comments on board, but has enough been done to change the reasons for refusal. The previous refusal talked about overbearing on the neighbourhood bedroom window, resulting in a substantial loss of outlook. The new application has been stepped back from the boundary line at the first floor level, but only by a metre, which doesn't make much of a difference from the outlook towards the North Downs. The North Downs above Bearsted and Hollingbourne, which are clearly visible, and due to a lack of development, they are some of the nicest parts of the Downs to look at. Both DM1 and DM9, which were mentioned in the refusal, talk about the loss of privacy for neighbours. DM1, Part 4, mentions overlooking or visual intrusion and unacceptable loss of privacy, while DM9, Part 3, says privacy and maintenance of a pleasant outlook of adjoining residents would be safeguarded. One unseen consequence of actually reducing the depth of the first floor is that now, as it is nearer the existing building line, more of the neighbour's garden is visible from the windows, reducing privacy further. So really, DM1 and DM9 are still valid reasons to object to this development. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Webb. I don't think there are any urgent updates on this, but can I take any declarations of lobbying? Thank you very much. And that's me as well. So, Kaz, have you got that? Can I ask people to put their hands up if they've been lobbied, please, clearly? Perry and Vizard. Vizard and Vizard. Yeah, okay. That's, I know, obviously, right, we'll call on the local member in a moment. Just one observation. It's obviously important to residents, but party wall legislation is not a planning consideration, so we should not be taking that into consideration as part of the discussion. That is between relevant lawyers on property owners. Councillor Parfitt, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would just really like to reiterate exactly what's been said by the two speakers. I really can't see the difference between this application and the previous one. If you actually go to that property and you visit that property and you see the proximity of that window, that bedroom window, to where the new extension will be, it is going to create a tunnel, because the Crispin Cottage actually has a slightly pitched higher up roof, and then the new proposed extension is going to be here, creating a dark tunnel straight down the middle. And so, to my mind, I think nothing really has changed. DM1 and DM9 still apply, and I think the size of this development is just way too big for a small 1890s cottage. They are really pretty small cottages. They just don't warrant having great big rear extensions on the back, on the side, and on that roof as well. You can see by that hedge the pitch of that roof, and it is just going to create a tunnel, and I think it is going to cause a real loss of privacy, light, and everything that's already been said.
If I could just, I think from the officer's report, it was quite clear that there are some differences between
Oh
the
yes,
application.
there are some. What I'm saying is they don't significantly make a difference.
And in terms of the light and overshadowing tests, which I believe have been done, that wouldn't be a ground of refusal, because it doesn't stack up in terms of the overshadowing and loss of light. The issue, I think, would be down to whether or not there is still an overbearing appearance and impact on a neighbouring property. I don't think we can actually say there's a loss of light or overshadowing, because the relevant tests have been done and it doesn't fail those. But the other issues, you know, members could go forward with those. Councillor Bryce.
Well, thank you, Chair, because that was the point I was just going to ask. Because it doesn't meet the two tests, are there grounds to refuse on the basis of loss of light? However much it may, it may look like it does. If it doesn't meet the tests, what would be the other grounds for refusal, bearing in mind some of the comments made? I have to say, I have a lot of sympathy for the actual applicants, because, they've had a huge housing estate built next to them. And I think if I were in their shoes, I'd be thinking, well, I've had several hundred houses built next to me. Why can't I perform an extension? But I understand it's got to be the right type of extension. It's got to meet all the regulations. So given what the speakers have said, what would be any options in terms of the loss of privacy or the overbearing nature?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In terms of privacy, it wouldn't actually be that different to what is currently the situation. I've been in the nearest bedroom of the application property. I've looked out of that window. You can already see the neighbour's patio and their garden. If anything, to my mind, it would be an improvement, because the window will actually be further away. So it will be further down. If we go back to the floor plan, it will be further from there, it will be further here, and the patio is down in the area here. So the angle would actually be more acute, that you would have to look down to see into the neighbour's patio. So in terms of privacy, I certainly don't think it would be any worse, and it would be better. Yeah. In terms of the outlook and whether it's overbearing, I'm not saying there wouldn't be an impact, but now that it has been moved away, it would be approximately 2 metres now from the edge of this window, instead of previously it would have been built up to the boundary, the last proposal. It's the combination of all the changes that the applicant has made. So the flank wall would be approximately 2 metres from the edge of this window here. The end of the extension has been pulled back, so it's actually a metre shorter than about 1.3 metres shorter than previously proposed. And also the roof would be hipped as well So that again would further reduce the impact on the neighbouring property. I think you know, as I've said in the report, you will still see the end of it out of the neighbour's window, but I don't think that now it would be in such a relationship as to sort of dominate and to such a harmful extent that it would justify a refusal that we could sustain an appeal.
Is there anyone who hasn't spoken already? Councillor Harwood.
Yeah, I'm struck that whenever we use the 2009 SPD on residential extensions, we often miss out some of the fundamental sections of it. I mean, for example, there are policies in there which are approved by an inspector which seek renewable energy. There are policies in there that seek integral niches for wildlife. I understand that most of this extension is north-facing, so therefore the solar PV or whatever might be difficult. But it's worth stating, it's paragraph 6.12 of the residential extensions SPD states consideration should be given to incorporating small-scale renewable energy generation, e.g. photovoltaics. Paragraph 6.25 states residential extensions provide good opportunities to include features to provide roosting and nesting opportunities for wildlife. So, that's in our policy and what we're promoting, backed up by the MPPG. So I would just ask that if we do grant permission this evening, that we do seek to deliver upon the agreed policy. And I remember at that inquiry for the SPD, the inspector actually picked out those two policies as being far-sighted.
I will leave the office for a moment or two to think about that and take Councillor Parfitt-Reid, who wanted to come back.
Thank you. I just really wanted to ask that to say that it's not overbearing, what is the... I'm actually speaking to the officer, but she's not listening. What is the percentage increase in the square footage of that extension on that small Victorian cottage?
I don't actually have the figures for that, because as the site is located in the urban area or within a built-up village settlement boundary, that's not one of the criteria that is normally assessed. There's not a sort of percentage like we would assess in the countryside. More, we'd sort of say 50% was modest. In this case, there isn't that requirement because of it being within the village settlement boundary. But I can tell you the original part of the cottage, and it's the same for the one next door, is that area there. And then this bit is a previous extension existing. And it's the same on the attached cottage, so that there and along the back are all extensions already existing, if that helps.
Well, I think basically what we're saying is we're doubling the square footage, and I don't see how that can be argued as not having an overbearing.
I think in terms, sorry, I'll keep saying this, but in terms of the overbearing, it isn't necessarily the square footage of the building, it's the impact of that building on, or the lack of impact depending, of that building on the area as a whole. So you have to take into account the overall street scene, the size of any gardens or the impact. So the problem is that is very subjective in many ways. In the open countryside, there is a calculation of area being extended, but Coxheath village centre is not where that's applied. So it does come down purely to the impact. I have to say that having been out to this area many times recently, that I personally think it would be very difficult to say that the impact is sufficient to justify a refusal, my personal opinion. I think it would be very hard to argue that.
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, I would just reiterate, I'm not saying there wouldn't be an impact, but I think now, given the changes that the applicant has made in terms of setting the extension in, hipping the roof and reducing the depth of it, I think it would not, that impact would not be bad enough to justify a refusal. That would be my advice to members. It's, in terms of whether it's overbearing, it's more sort of whether it's going to whether it's going to dominate the other property or not. And I think, as I said, my professional view is that I'm not saying there wouldn't be an impact, but it wouldn't be bad enough to justify refusal.
Well, unless anyone has anything, Councillor Atkinson, and then I'll wrap up.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Going on from what Councillor Harwood was saying, I'd also like to see bee bricks for solitary bees. I know you might think I've got a bee in my bonnet, but I'd like that. But it also brings me on to the fact that all these applications we've got, none of them seem to mention ecological enhancements like bird, bat and bee bricks. And it makes me wonder if the same thing is happening on planning applications delegated to the officers. Are they being omitted from that? Because we put these conditions on the ones we decide here, but do we know whether they're being put on to cases decided on delegated authority?
Councillor Atkinson, as a result, after the last meeting, I did undertake to pursue this issue, and it is being pursued, and a report that will be reported back to this committee in due course. But as a result of actions that are being undertaken by myself, the Vice Chairman, and indeed will include you as the Labour Group spokesman in due course. But yes, the concern is duly noted. I think personally, I would like to suggest we do proceed with the integral niches for wildlife, including poor lonely solitary bees. Sorry, I shouldn't joke, but it's a serious issue. But given the north-facing nature of this building, I think it personally would be too onerous to go for a solar PV on this because of the orientation of the building. Normally I would, but not on the north-facing slope. Do members think that's reasonable? Okay, in that case, I shall put that amended recommendation for approval forward if I have a seconder. Councillor Wilby, do you wish to speak? Okay, those in favour of the amended recommendation to grant? Those against? Abstentions? We did effectively have a coffee break earlier, despite it's supposed to be. Does anyone desperately need to see if there's any coffee left there, or shall we? There isn't any coffee. Oh, is there not? In that case, there will literally only be a 5-minute recess, and for anyone who needs to go to the toilet. Ladies and gentlemen, if I can bring you back to order and we move on. Well, actually, we don't move on very far. We're still in Councillor Webb's ward. Item 16, land adjacent to Hazeldean, Dean Street, East Farley, Kent.
Thank you, Chair. This is a planning application for the erection of 2 4-bedroom detached properties. The application site is in the open countryside, but as you can see on the image here, the site sits within a wider cluster of buildings. Hazeldean is the existing property outlined in blue. The planning application site represents its former substantial side garden. This is the existing host property, the existing gates into the host property, and the application site is the garden that stretches between the main house towards the neighbours to the south. This is looking from the neighbouring property back towards the application site, which is behind here. I should draw members' attention to the the urgent update, which corrects the boundary plan that is in the agenda. In the agenda, the boundary is shown in error as being immediately adjacent to the neighbouring property. If you see the plan in your urgent update, the true boundary site is further to the north away from the neighbours. This is a view looking over the fence, courtesy of Google Street View, into the property. Again, you can see the original host property there. The neighbours are set back behind a substantial fence and tree boundary. This is the correct site boundary, so you can see here the separation of the site boundary to the neighbours. This is the original house. It still retains a substantial garden for future occupiers. Members should note this clear line here, which is the sort of traditional rear garden line of properties along this frontage. The application won't extend beyond that, so officers consider that the principle of development within this plot doesn't extend the urban area and keeps it in character with the neighbours. These are the 2 properties. You can see from the footprint it's effectively 2 chalet-style buildings, and the officer has identified on here the separation from the neighbours. We are happy that there is no overlooking due to the nature of the windows and the arrangements. They're fairly traditional modern buildings in style, chalet style with the upper floor set into the roof. The design of the properties is appropriate for the location. There's a mixture of traditional, but both sides of the application site, very modern dwellings. So they're in keeping with the street scene. In terms of the policy tests in SP17 and DM30, we are content that the character of the development is in keeping with the wider setting, and we recommend approval.
Thank you very much. The officer has drawn attention to the fact there's an urgent update. Can I take any declarations of lobbying at this point? Anyone? Oh, well, there you go. Your light's still on. Right, the first speaker on his application is actually an East Farley Parish Councillor, but he's speaking for the objectors. Councillor Hussain.
Good evening. Tonight I'm here speaking on behalf of Mr and Mrs Sands of 4 Dane Park, Dean Street, their house being in close proximity to the proposed development and accordingly negatively affected. The homeowners themselves are unable to attend due to a pre-planned foreign holiday. In the time allowed, I will put forward their case for refusing the developer's application. 1, our views from the side of the house currently to open countryside will be spoilt by the proposed development. The proposed house would back directly onto our boundary fence and extend approximately 18 metres past the rear of our property. This means that when we are in our rear garden or exit the side door of our house, rather than enjoy views of open countryside, we would now be looking at a two-storey bungalow and double garage running directly along the side of the fence for a distance of 25 metres. Secondly, no consideration has been made with the proposed development to retain the current forward-facing outlook of the existing properties along Dean Street. Point 2, our privacy will be severely diminished and be detrimental to our quality of life. The corner of the proposed double garage is less than 1 metre from our fence. Secondly, 2 windows will now look directly into our rear garden and be directly opposite our first floor balcony. Whilst we understand that both windows at first floor level will have frosted type glazing, they can still be opened at the height of above 1.7 metres. Thirdly, there are inaccurate and misleading drawings. The layout of the proposed properties in relation to our house has not been clearly identified on the planning application drawings. In plan view, showing our house, our boundary fence and the footprint of the proposed properties. And lastly, according to Mr. and Mrs. Sands, they asked planning to visit them on site in order for them to graphically explain these issues, but that didn't take place. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor O'Callaghan, East Farley Parish Council, please.
Good evening. East Farley Parish Council discussed this planning application and the planning committee unanimously voted against approval. Firstly and foremost, East Farley is designated as open countryside in the local plan, and contrary to SB 17, the Parish Council considers this proposal harmful to the nature and appearance of that part of the village. Whilst the Parish Council's views are informed by the village plan, we don't currently have a neighbourhood plan, which is that was opposed to further development because of the harm it would do to the rural nature and because of the impact on the local infrastructure, where the roads are typically unlit lanes, often without footpaths. It does look, the council does look at the merits of all applications, but this one, as opposed to 2 others that we've recently looked at, which involved new build in the village, didn't pass our consideration. The village is characterised by hamlets rather than having one principal centre, and this particular hamlet in the junction of Forge Lane and Dean Street with its associated conservation area, this site is just to the south of that, and as you've heard, will build on a garden that currently provides an unbuilt break in the street scene. Maidstone Borough Council have previously refused development on this site in the past, and the PC, Parish Council, are mindful that the cumulative impacts of creeping infill and its impact on the dispersed nature of the built environment that characterises much of the village. With East Farley designated as open countryside, the views of the Parish Council and the Borough Council are usually aligned, so we were a bit surprised by this one, I have to say, when we're considering new build, and that's why we asked to be here tonight. You've heard that we consider this, or it's an infill proposal, and we consider, having listened to the neighbours, that this affects their residential amenity. And finally, on the subject of sustainability, yes, the proposal would likely offer some marginal benefit to the economic sustainability of the village, but probably also aggravate environmental considerations because, contrary to what's said in the report, there is no real alternative to car journeys for these properties. They're away from the main village amenities. There are no footpaths in the area, so getting to the bus stops or to any of the amenities would be walking on dangerous lanes that have become a rat run. The bus service that is provided runs, I think, 5 times a day in each direction, and as I say, there is a dangerous walk to the bus stop. So we ask you to refuse this application.
Thank you, Councillor. Miss Harvey for the applicant, please.
Good evening, Chairman, members. This application seeks to make efficient use of an existing underused area of garden within the village of East Farley. This application would provide 2 chalet-style detached houses in a very spacious layout, being set well back from the site frontage. The proposed layout would also allow for generous gaps between the proposed houses and the nearest neighbours, and between the 2 proposed infill houses. It is acknowledged that this part of East Farley is washed over by a countryside designation. However, East Farley is a settlement which has the character of a small village, and our proposal would retain that open village character. This site is currently closed off from public views by virtue of the existing solid fence along the frontage, and our proposal would open up the site and allow views into and through the site from the public highway. Furthermore, the removal of the frontage fencing would eliminate a particularly negative feature from the street scene. The character of this part of East Farley is one of ribbon development with clusters of development around nodes where roads meet one another. Our proposal would provide a sensitively designed infill scheme between 2 existing clusters of housing on the west side of Dean Street, being the existing 2-storey detached houses at Dane Park and the cluster of built development around the Dean Street, Forge Lane, New Cut junctions. The scale of development being 2 chalet-style homes, and the size of the plots has been proposed to follow the pattern of development locally, which is one of medium to large houses on large plots with good spacing between properties. The height of the proposed houses has been kept relatively low, with the first floor being contained entirely within the roof space. This will provide a sensitive transition between the 2.5-storey houses at Dane Park and the chalet bungalow at Hazeldean. Proposal also retains a significant setback to the front building line to reflect the existing building line within the street seam and to provide an improved open landscaped frontage to Dean Street. The design of the houses is vernacular in its style and would utilise red bricks, weatherboarding and plain tiles. The planning officer has found the design to be of a high quality which would respect the site and its surroundings. The character and appearance of the area would not therefore be harmed. The application has been amended following concerns from neighbours in relation to overlooking, and now all first floor flank windows are shown to be bathroom or ensuite only, with obscured glazing controlled by condition. Our proposal would provide a well-designed and sensitive infill scheme on this underused garden area, which can accommodate 2 dwellings comfortably, whilst also retaining a generous garden to Hazeldean. In this respect, 2 windfall houses will add to the council's housing land supply, which includes windfall provision within its 5-year supply figures, without causing harm to the character and appearance of the area. Accordingly, it is hoped that the committee will support the officer's recommendation and grant planning permission this evening. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Councillor Webb, please.
Hello again, committee. Right. Look in the papers in front of members. We're presented with a very good and extensive summary of reasons for recommendation. However, I have a few concerns with them. Paragraph 1 mentions a relatively large group of buildings to the north. It is relatively large for a small hamlet, but is only really 20 to 30 houses, which is surrounded by fields, and nearly all of these have to rely on a small car park or on-street parking in Forge Lane. Paragraph 2, we are told it is near a bus route, but to get to the bus stop, it is a walk along the country lane with no footpath, where it is meant to be 30 miles an hour, but I'm afraid most drivers don't stick to that speed. Paragraph 3 considers the existing developments that have occurred in their locality, but if that thought was extended, no part of the countryside would be safe from urban sprawl. Paragraph 4 states that the open character and view are maintained, yet, by definition, if you are building houses, you are closing the character and obstructing the views. Paragraph 5 talks about preventing unacceptable, unneighbourly impact. Yet, as a 4-bedroom home, they will shortly become family homes. And though the garden is spacious, the southern building is near enough to Dane Park that, especially in summer, with windows open, the neighbours will likely be hearing TVs or radios playing. Paragraph 6 mentions the highways issues. In the consultation letter from Caton Highways, it states visibility displays are adequate for a road with this speed limit. However, as I stated earlier, it is not unusual for cars to speed excessively along this road, and that does raise safety concern as it is a straight stretch past. Finally, Paragraph 17 relates to the policies in the local plan. SP 17, Part 1, states development will not result in harm to the character and appearance of the area. Yet this is what will be happening in this area of green along the country road, so surely gives reason to refuse planning permission in this case. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Just one initial point. Planning policy does not protect private views, it protects public views. So a lot has been made about the private views. That is not a planning consideration. Public views are. If you can see something from the road, a public footpath, a vantage point of any sort that is generally accessible to the public, but not from a private house or operation of that kind. Over to you, the ward member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just really wanted to, I've got a couple of points that I want to make. I find the first one is about the street scene. If you go down Dean Street, all the houses face to the road in the same orientation. And with this, it just seems that they've been put at perpendicular, and I just think that doesn't particularly enhance the street scene. I would also question whether that great big chunk of land is actually infill. To me, infill implies you've got two houses and you could perhaps put another one in between. That is a lot. I don't think that is what I would class as infill. The third thing I wanted to say, which I think is very important, the sustainability. I don't know if anybody has ever tried to walk down Dean Street. I have when I've, yeah, it is lethal and you dice with death, and you actually have to, when I've been leafleting down there, I've actually had to wear a high-vis vest. It is really dangerous, and so I don't think getting to bus stops is an option from there. And the other thing I just wanted to ask, because I'm a little bit confused, we had an urgent update with a change in the boundary, yet the first speaker spoke about the garage and the window being 1 metre from the fence. That change in the boundary doesn't look like 1 metre to me, and so I would just like some clarification there.
Just to be clear, the urgent update isn't a change to the application boundary. It's simply showing the boundary that is in the planning application. What happened is when the committee report was prepared, the GIS system spat out a plan and it plotted the boundary incorrectly. The boundary in your urgent update is the same boundary as is in the planning application. So it was simply that the boundary in the printed agenda was misleading because the GIS system slid it down. If we go back to, well, if you look at in the urgent update and on this picture here, you can see that whilst the properties are indeed close to the boundary, there is a degree of separation between this house and its garden boundary. This house has a substantial side garden and goes beyond. It doesn't quite show on here, but so effectively the dwelling is here, this property's garden is here and wraps around the rear, but the property isn't cheek and jowl with that house, although as you can see from this map, other properties in the area are very closely juxtaposed, so that isn't an uncommon relationship.
No, so it can't be that that house is every metre away from the boundary fence, surely?
Well, the boundary maybe, but not the house.
Yeah, sorry, let me go to that annotated drawing for you. You can see that the garage element here sits adjacent to the boundary fence, but because of that garden area between the two, there is a further separation of approximately 20 metres to what is really the flank of the neighbouring house rather than the primary elevation. The windows in this elevation are obscure glazed. They're a standard opening above 1.7 metres, so you wouldn't get any outlook from them. We are happy that there is no immediate overlooking because the outlook sits here. So yes, it does They exploit the site boundaries by pushing the houses adjacent to them, but they do so in a manner that doesn't affect the amenity of the neighbours. Yes, the neighbour will see some of the bulk of the building, but there is a degree of planting. If we go back, you can see there is some substantial landscaping in the neighbouring property.
Yeah. So what you're saying there, Austin, is that effectively, when it's not enforced anymore, but there used to be a Kent Design Guide distance between properties of 22 metres. So it's pretty much on that old separation for that distance.
Sorry, yes, and 22 metres is principally between facing habitable elevations.
Yes, but I'm saying that even if it was, it would have met that old criteria.
It would be within the tolerances that we've widely accepted, yes.
Yeah. Councillor Harwood.
Thank you, Chairman. I mean, this, on any measure, is a very balanced application in terms of the countryside protection, and landscape protection and local character protection, because the open spaces in the very kind of strung out hamlet that is Dean Street are very, very important. So I would have thought that and it's also worth saying it's a highly unsustainable location in terms of transport and in terms of the dwelling houses. 4-bedroom houses use a lot of energy, they could produce a lot of emissions and so on. But we have got an officer recommendation for approval. We seem to have a kind of argument that the offence is being removed, which seems a bit odd. But I would have thought that the burden of planning here, if we were to meet the aspirations of the MPPF and the MPPG, were for high quality in terms of design, high quality in terms of sustainability, and in terms of the landscape setting. We do not currently have that as is. I actually think, because I'm finding this time and time again, that there is, and I think probably with the development agents in this case, I think the development agents are coming along saying we need to encompass this with good landscaping, we need to build in renewable energy, and then officers are saying no, we don't need to do that, because there's almost a fundamentalist anti-renewable energy feeling comes out of the planning team at the moment, which is being forced from a couple of places. And I think here, when you do have remote locations in unsustainable locations, what the MPPF and the MPPG say is that you need to, through that balancing act, actually state that this is reaching those sustainability imperatives. So my view is that because of that balance, I think we can overcome the issue around the landscape impact, because after all, it is garden, it is currently quite open, but we need to do more than we've currently got here. So what I think is that we need to evidence that we can enclose the entire site in terms of hedgerow boundaries. I think on the site frontage, I think we need to intersperse that hedgerow at least 2 hedgerow trees, so it fits in with what certainly the better bit of Dean Street as you're heading towards the pub. I think we need to do that if it'll make this acceptable. I also think that a 4-bedroom home as remote as this, 2 of them, we need to build in a condition around some renewable energy generation. I suggest solar PV would work with the orientation here. So I think with those 2 changes, you're just nudging the balance in favour of approval, because we can take our chances at appeal, but I think with a higher quality development, higher quality landscaping, I think we could do it. So therefore, with those 2 changes to the plan, and I'm prepared to give delegated powers to the officers to negotiate them, I am prepared to move that we do grant planning permission as per the papers and the urgent update. Thank you.
We lost an appeal last week in a far less sustainable location than this, and the inspector was scathing about the sustainability arguments, I think we would have a problem. I have got you added to the list. Right, well, I wasn't going to speak again now, but I will. I think this council and the planning inspectorate are totally inconsistent about sustainability, and until PINs get themselves sorted out and actually decide whether or not it applies, it is quite dangerous for local authorities to rely on that argument. We also won an appeal in the same week, and we had two completely different planning inspectors' decisions saying two completely different things, and it is bonkers. On the infill issue, yes, PINs have been totally inconsistent over the years on what is infill and what isn't. At the moment, they're saying this is infill and they're in favour of it. But that might change next week with the planning inspectorate we got. Somewhat reluctantly, I look at this site and I think, yes, SP17 does apply, but I actually look at this and I think, and I had a disagreement with a good-natured one with the officers, and I said, I think this needs a complete landscaping scheme. I don't think this should be open in the way the applicant's saying. I think that this should actually be have a comprehensive landscaping scheme on the site and actually improve the landscape here, because actually it's a field at the moment with 2 trees in it. I don't actually think it's a particularly high landscape quality now. I've seen recreation grounds with better landscape quality. I actually think we can get a much better look to this site if it's properly landscaped and with the right planting. And that's my personal view, and I think we should be very clear that we're looking for a very high quality landscaping scheme here, and because it's an unsustainable location, in my opinion, I think it is reasonable to seek sustainability offset here, not to a massive degree, but enough to actually say that we've looked at a sustainability argument, and to be honest, going forward, it's in the interest of anyone who's going to occupy these properties. To be honest, it's going to be in their interest going forward, so I don't really see why anyone should be against it. So that's my view because of where we are. It's not necessarily where I'd want to be, but I think that is frankly where we are until the government planning inspectorate get themselves sorted out. So slightly reluctantly, I will support the motion. Councillor Wilby, you are next.
Yeah, sorry, Chair, you've actually Tony's covered most of it, and so has everyone else. It's just about 6.29. I was just trying to find it as a condition that the highways have actually recommended about the electric charging points. I know it's one with...
Is that a condition?
But I'm trying to find it just now before talking. So could the officer just answer that one quickly?
While Austin's looking, I'll take Councillor Mumford. Condition 9, apparently. Oh, 8, sorry. Councillor Mumford.
We're all allowed our own opinions, and you've got yours, Mr. Chairman. Presumption in favour of towards sustainable development. I'm asked to favour those. I don't believe this is a sustainable location. There are no shops. It is the open countryside, and to get to the bus is a bit dangerous. Then I'm asked under SP17, if I want to build in the countryside, I must have a policy. There's no policy that would support this. I'm on the curtilage of a conservation area. And my officer is particularly just ignoring that. You're talking about infill in the countryside. Yeah, it's a big garden, it's a field. I hear what Councillor Harwood's saying, I hear what the chairman's saying, but I would like to see it enhance, as it states. We should be responding positively to, and where possible, enhancing. And I want to see that. I'm not willing to give delegated powers to the officers. I would willingly, if but I might be in a minority, vote against this. But I most definitely will not give vote for anything that gives delegated powers. I want to see the renewables. I want to see the landscaping. I want to see it positively respond, because it's not sustainable. There is no policy under SP17. It's on the curtilage of a conservation area, and how the heck you can have infill described on that plan, I have no idea.
I'm going to come back to Councillor Harwood, but personally I would have no problem at all, and Austin has just confirmed from the officer's point of view, he would have absolutely no problem with the condition wording coming back to this committee for approval.
If I may come in as the mover, when I was moving that we had those two amendments in order to make it sustainable development, that if negotiations had failed, it would come back to committee anyway. However, I'm quite happy to have the burden even higher, that we actually bring back the scheme so that we as a committee can decide whether it is the balance that we require in such an unsustainable location.
If I understood it, Chair, you are delegating the wording of the condition to officers, but you want the subsequent landscaping and renewable scheme to come back to committee.
Exactly.
Yes.
Thank you, Chairman. Well, I'm afraid I disagree with what's being said, and I'd like to hear the views of other members around this table, actually, before we rush to decisions. I'm very much in line with what Councillor Mumford has said, and I'm very confused about the report, actually, because when I read para 702, it's clearly, he says it's not sustainable, and then in 701 it says it's in the countryside, so on that basis SP17 does apply. And I'm looking, I've got SP17 in front of me, and I absolutely agree with what Councillor Mumford has said. And then the other point that, again, I find rather strange, is it talks about garden developments in the garden, and DM11 doesn't apply, even though the parish council raised it. And yet when we go down to para 606, it says the site was formerly used as a plant nursery, which appears to have ceased trading in 1995. The site has the benefit of a certificate of lawful granted in 2000 under reference 06/1072, confirming lawful use as a residential garden. So I'm slightly confused here whether this is a garden development or not. And so the whole thing, I think there's real grounds here for refusal, and I totally agree with Councillor Mumford on this, and certainly I will not be voting for it, because I think the report isn't quite straight, and this is development in the open countryside. SP17 does apply, and I think DM11 also applies, and I think these are very good reasons for refusal. Thank you, Chairman.
Unless I'm completely potty, if it's got a certificate of lawful development for a residential garden, it's a garden development, isn't it?
Chair, yes. I mean, the site's previous use as a nursery, they would have required permission to change the use of the land to residential garden. That they clearly used it and obtained a certificate of lawful use rather than planning permission, but the effect of the two is the same. So this is a planning application for development on garden land within the countryside. The NPPF states that previously developed land does not include gardens in urban areas, but it does not exclude this overall site as being defined as previously developed land. It's that strange interpretation that the Secretary of State has between the two. Of course, the guidance is that it doesn't mean that you can exploit the whole site. You still have to have regard to the character of the area, and that's where SP17 comes in. You've expressed your various views on whether this is infill or not. It's a single plot. Yes, it's a large plot, and therefore the gap they're infilling is quite large. But there is no specific guidance on how we define the width of an infill plot. So we have to accept that there is substantial development on either side, and therefore it is infilling. Unlike, for example, the field opposite, that would not be an infill development. But I think we have to accept that by definition, this is an infill, albeit quite a significant gap between.
Yeah, it's like the Abingdon case. Right. Yeah, it is potty, but there is case law on this. Councillor Brown.
So just to summarise then, so I've got this straight, it's, because I think the report refers to it as kind of countryside. So because it's got a certificate of lawfulness to say it is part of somebody's back garden, therefore it's not designated as open countryside because it's got that standing, and therefore we should consider it as infill.
No, sorry, no, not at all. It is in the open countryside, but it's deemed to be residential curtilage. So as residential curtilage, it's defined as previously developed land, but it is still in the countryside. So SB 17 does apply.
Right, okay, good to get that clarified then. So I had two main follow-up points then. One was on the report, so under paragraph, and forgive me if because I've just picked up the papers tonight, but on 6.28 on page 77, it says about the type of frontage. So it seems to say that the brick access would be removed and replaced with post and rail fencing. But on the plan you showed earlier, it had lots of trees as a boundary. So what is going to be at the front?
Indeed. No, we don't want to see any fencing. Doesn't mean there isn't going to be any, but we don't want to see it. Sorry about that. Councillor Atkinson, you get the last word, and then I am going to move to...
Thank you. Does that wall actually belong to the neighbouring property? That's what seems to be the case. And if that's the case, how are we ever going to be able to enforce the guideline?
As Austin might be able to say, but I'm going to sort of come in. There is something called a Grampian condition, which was evolved in the Grampian, believe it or not, to actually cover this sort of situation. So that is what we will be imposing, and that is a condition specifically designed to deal with the fact that a piece of land is not in the ownership of the property that's being developed.
Well,
not on the site of the property that's being developed. I should have said not ownership.
Yes, just to add to that, the Grampian condition should only be used where it's reasonably foreseeable that you could achieve the benefit. But because the adjoining land is in the control of the applicant, yes, it's reasonable to rely on that condition. If the applicant sold Hazeldean to one party and the application site to another, whoever bought the southern site couldn't develop or occupy their properties, without that access being achieved. So you would assume that a diligent purchaser would note that, and the deal would be done so that the two arrangements are dealt.
Yeah, it's one of those wonders of planning law. Right up there with Wednesbury definitions of reasonable on this, which we all love to talk about. Right, I think it's all been said on either side. Is everyone clear about the amended proposal that's been moved and seconded? Did you want to add something, Councillor?
Yes, I'd just like to add in the usual bit about bee bricks in, I think it was, condition 13.
Yes, that is part of the sustainability issue. Yes, solitary bees in the relevant condition. Well, you're not a beekeeper, are you, Keith? Just out of curiosity, I just wondered. Sorry, sorry about that. It'd be a very small hive with a solitary bee. I'm sorry. Right, all those clear on what we can. Okay, right. We are including your point about coming back to committee with the full landscaping and sustainability plans. Did you want to add anything?
Yeah, that wasn't my point. My point was, this is so unacceptable to me and drives across all the countryside policies that, yes, I'm happy to consider it under a decent landscaping. It fits in and enhances the countryside. I want to consider the whole application again. So what I'm probably amending the proposal that we defer this and allow officers to renegotiate it so it is more acceptable to the countryside policies.
Can I just check?
Chair, to come back on that point, I think if I've got the application plots here, if officers were concerned whether we could get enough landscaping to satisfy the requests of councillors, then I might agree that we would defer and bring the solution to the problem back to you. But if you look at this drawing, there's ample land within the curtilage to give us comfort that we will be able to negotiate that scheme, albeit we'll bring it back for your approval. So I don't think that deferral is necessary to agree the principle of development. I think we have sufficient comfort that the plot is large enough to accommodate the landscaping, retain the amenity of the occupants and the neighbours, without the whole thing having to come back in one go. We can agree the principle subject to a condition requiring a high quality landscaping scheme.
There was also the question of renewables that Councillor Harwood brought up.
I was proposing, and I think Councillor Harwood and I were in agreement with this, that we would be looking for a renewables solution on this, along with the change that Councillor Atkins just suggested in relation to the ecological. Can you just confirm?
Yes, condition 4 requires a landscaping scheme, so the request for landscaping is already there. The applicants here, we've got your message about the quality of the scheme that you will expect to come back to you. If you want a condition regarding a renewable scheme, then we can put a fairly standard worded condition requiring the applicant to examine and bring forward an appropriate renewable scheme. I don't suggest that we set a particular target, but if landscaping is coming back to you, then the renewables condition can come back to you at the same time.
I think it was clear both were coming back.
Yeah. And we can add a condition regarding the birds, bees and bats.
Okay. Ms Mayom, right.
In response to that, we allowed an applicant to come back with a renewable plan where we didn't set targets, and we ended up with enough renewables to boil a kettle once a week. I think we should be looking for a 10%.
I have no personal objection to setting a target. Councillor Harwood?
10% is what is used the length and breadth of the country.
That's what we're going to do.
So
then.
I think it's a recognisable one. And on the landscaping scheme, because this is open countryside, we must insist that this is a native landscaping scheme. You know, we don't want like the red robin hedge that we've had spring up in Dean Street, which is horrendous. We need a hawthorn or a hazel or whatever it's meant to be there.
Well, given the name of the property, I would have thought Hazel was definitely appropriate. Sorry. Right, anything else? Because it is important to get this scheme right if it's approved. I mustn't jump to conclusions. Okay, now in that case, I'm moving the amended recommendation to the vote. Those in favour of the amended recommendation? Those against? Abstentions? Substantial abstentions. Right, that is passed, and we await developments. Right, I might take a different view on the next one. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Can I assure that the legal officer has just asked me to remind everyone that although some of us, myself included, can certainly reach the back of the room without the microphone, that for the public record it is important to use them. We now move on to, once again, Hen and Duckhurst Farm. Congratulations, Mrs. Bully. You finally got to an application where you're actually here when we hear it. But okay, so we move on to that. Over to you. Just to remind people that Councillor Bryce has just changed roles, and that's why she's sitting over there. Right.
Thank you, Chair. Members will recall that this application was deferred for consideration a few meetings ago in order that officers would investigate the alternative measures for enforcement of noise from construction sites. To begin with, there is an urgent update that covers 3 points. There is a further representation that's been submitted since the previous agenda was prepared. The objector reiterates that there have been numerous breaches on the site and lists them as early working hours, mud on roads, etc. The officer has confirmed that that complaint has been forwarded to the Community Protection Team. We also asked the Community Protection Team to clarify which complaints or what complaints they had received and when, and what had happened to date. You can see that they had received 6 complaints in June and a further complaint in August. They asked residents to complete and submit noise diaries. Now, the officer says that no diaries have been returned, and I'm not sure whether that's because residents are still collecting data. If that is the case, I would advise residents to submit what they have rather than making the list longer and longer, because I think it's important that the Community Protection Team understand on an ongoing basis what is happening. And you can see that an officer has been on site in response to a suggestion of early hour working. Unfortunately, at the time that the officer visited, he didn't consider that there were unreasonable levels of noise occurring at the site. Of course, it is dependent upon work and the officer visit coinciding in order that the Community Protection Team can acknowledge that there is a harmful activity. But in the officer's amended report, because you asked us to clarify exactly what the procedures were, you will see that the officer has set out in the report the various options and legislation available to our Community Protection Team. We met with them, or I think we've met with them 3 times since the last committee, to clarify which measures they can use, which measures they do use, and how they use them. And that process is set out in the report. You'll see in paragraphs 202 and to 204, in effect, what they try to do is escalate the the degree of investigation. So they start informally by engaging with the other party. They rely on residents collecting evidence initially to justify further action. It's then their responsibility to continue investigations to a level to seek to engage with the contractors to remedy any actions. If they don't, the degree of intervention can escalate. So they can serve a notice formally requiring remedial measures. Although it's not listed in the report, the ultimate course of action, if they don't comply with those, is legal action in the courts to seek an injunction or other means to prevent those works. I think the frustration that residents probably experience is almost the syncopation of those two elements of there's an event, but by the time the officer gets there, that event hasn't happened, and it's a case of how the CP team are able to be there and respond to collect enough evidence as to the event, you know, the noise breaches. I've provided Chair with a statement setting out the procedures. I think we've acknowledged as a result of the process of investigating this application that the council's website doesn't properly identify the processes that residents should follow. It misdirects them to the planning team rather than the community protection team. The website doesn't provide copies of the guidelines so that residents can understand what our community protection team consider acceptable. So I've suggested to the Chair those are two actions that need to be remedied, that we provide clarity on the website or any other literature what the proper process is, because that means that residents don't chase the planning department for 2 months and nothing happens, when it's the community protection team that they should be chasing. So to provide clear guidance and to provide clarity on the guidelines that we also provide to developers so they have an understanding of what we would and would not consider reasonable activity. So that explains the conversations we've had with CPT and the alternative measures. So the recommendation that the officers make is as before, that strictly speaking, the condition doesn't pass the tests of necessity, etc. There are options available to members. You could amend the condition, you could keep the condition, but I'd remind members that if either of those are an option that you follow, all that condition does is control certain hours of work. It doesn't control the noise. So the developer you'd still have to follow the environmental health community protection complaint processes to deal with noise, even if you chose to leave the planning condition on or amend it for the extra hour. So it won't deal with some of the concerns that you have.
Thank you. We will be discussing those other issues later, but I think we do need to determine the issue relating to the proposed amendment to the condition first. So at that point, you've mentioned the urgent update, can I take any declarations of lobbying before we go to speakers? I assume the Staplehurst members have been lobbied? And I have too. Anyone else? No. Okay. In that case, we move to the speakers. Mr. Bowden. Or Bowden, I'm not sure which it is. Thank you.
I did prepare a speech, but having read the latest notes and appraisal, I put the speech to one side and drafted some new notes. Having read the latest appraisal, the word noise keeps coming up all the time. This issue is not just about noise. It's about noise and working hours. This particular developer takes it upon himself to decide what working hours he chooses to work, even though there's currently hours specified. The request to change the working hours, as he has done, to start earlier on a Saturday, I see as absolutely no problem at all, because it is within your standard conditions. And so that is so clear, it should be just agreed. The problem here is that the working hours need to be adhered to, and that's where the problem arises. During working hours, the contractor, the developer, does make some what we might consider unnecessary noise, and that can be dealt with under the various acts and with your community protection team. For people, residents, to have to constantly log noises that they make, and they're making noises all the time, they get fed up after a while. So you don't hear all the complaints. I hear a lot of them because I'm a local resident, and it's annoying for people. But noise has to happen. It's a building site. So hopefully that can be dealt with as a separate issue. It is the working hours and working outside of the working hours. There needs to be stated working hours, and then if the developer works outside of those hours, that's where you need to come in and stamp on them under these various acts that you can use. At the moment, it seems to be left to the residents to complain. If the contractor, in your current proposals, I should say, there is no reference at all to working hours. That gives the developer the right to work every day of the year, Saturdays, Sundays, bank holidays, Christmas and everything. And it leaves the residents to have to complain then, to log it, that the man worked on Christmas Day to finish the job, and then when you come back from your holiday, you might look into it. That is not acceptable. There needs to be working hours, which is standard practice throughout the country. And in my job as an engineer, I've never come across a site where they don't have strict working hours, which both sides understand and they work to. If they don't work to them, they get trodden on.
Okay, so
and that's
so
as
that's
it should be.
your time now.
Thanks very much.
Okay. Councillor Buller, please.
The Parish Council wished to see this application to extend the Saturday working hours for the Hen and Ducker site refused. The developers of this site are frequently in breach of Condition 20 by working on Saturday afternoons, Sundays and bank holidays, as well as starting and finishing outside of their weekday hours. Despite many requests, the enforcement team have not taken any action. The MPPF in Section 58 states, effective enforcement is important to maintain public confidence in the planning system. To extend the hours on Saturdays will make this situation worse. The Parish Council is now dismayed that the planning officer wants to remove Condition 20, which the planning department set in June 2015. Local residents will then have to rely on this developer following good practice. We have no confidence that this will happen. The only recourse left to residents is to involve the Environmental Protection Team. From its Freedom of Information request, the Parish Council has learned that NBC has used the Control of Pollution Act 1974, Section 60, which specifies conditions of working hours, on just 6 occasions this century, in 2000, 2001, 2003, 2007, 2012, and January 2014. Not an impressive record. If Condition 20 is removed, does this mean the site has no restrictions whatsoever on hours of working? Please answer this so I can inform the residents. The Environmental Protection Act seems to be concerned with noise rather than hours of working. Housing development is noisy, but if there are no controls on working hours, then residents will not know when they will get any peace. I understand that this team work office hours only, so how can they witness any breaches? Sadly, the community is experiencing many unacceptable issues from this development, such as off-site parking, mud and dust spread across the parish, deliveries in the middle of the night, lorries blocking the Marvin Road, and lack of communication with local residents. We're also very concerned about the management of foul and surface waters drainage. This estate is likely to take up to 5 years to complete. Local residents deserve to have times when they can open their windows and enjoy some peace in their gardens. If you do decide to transfer Condition 20 to the Environmental Protection Team, please write to all these residents, giving them the contact details and explaining what protection they will have. Action on antisocial working practice should be immediate. Will it be? Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Councillor Buller. I suppose I should say Mrs. Bryce.
Mrs. Bryce. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, members. A lot's already been said that I won't cover. It's not about the noise, the volume from the site. It's about protecting residents so that, you know, come 1 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon, they know they can sit in their back gardens. Come 5 o'clock on a Friday afternoon, they can crack open their G&T, as one may want, and sit there and enjoy the peace of their gardens. And we can't at the moment because this developer consistently flouts their times. So they worked late on Friday the 21st of June, they worked all day on Saturday the 22nd of June, they worked all day on Sunday the 23rd of June, they worked late into the evening on Friday the 12th of July. This week I came back from holiday to be greeted by 2 residents complaining about out-of-hours working. They aren't always completing the diaries, but some do have that in progress, and given they're advised to spend about a month completing them, that's why they haven't had them back. So it's not that the developer has suddenly turned over a new leaf and is not working out of hours. They still are working out of hours. In fact, the construction director asked me to keep an eye on it and then phone him when they were working out of hours, to which I reminded him that it was his job to be on site, enforcing the fact that his site stopped. So if the guy running the site isn't even sure what time they're doing, then I don't know what to do. But the nub of my argument is that an officer is required to be present to witness out-of-hours working if criminal proceedings were to be brought against someone working out of hours, which I understand from the CPT team is the main enforcement tool that they have in their armour to take criminal action. And a council officer, not a resident, has to be present to witness this. So that puts the onus on an officer being around to witness this. And then I asked the senior officer, Kevin Metland, do you have any officers routinely working out of hours before 8 a.m. on Monday to Friday, after 6 p.m. or over the weekend and bank holidays? And he said no officers regularly respond out of hours. So you're handing over enforcement to a team who are unable to enforce. Residents can't collect out of hours evidence. It won't stack up in court. It has to be an officer recording and witnessing it. And if you aren't going to resource that team to be able to do that role, then how on earth can you hand over responsibility for it to those people? Mr. Metland, when I asked him about this, and he's not here to respond, but he said, well, we just wouldn't tell the developer so they wouldn't know. So, you know, it sets a very dangerous precedent. This developer's generating a lot of complaints, and we really do need to be seen to be able to act on the best interests of our residents. Many thanks.
Thank you. All right. Councillor Perry.
Writings. I do know what I'm going to say, actually. I don't really need to. Councillor Bryce and Councillor Buller has said it all, and I'm not going to repeat it. Quite frankly, relying on the enforcement protection is just not good enough. It is not good enough and will not work. And let's get down to basics here. And now let me just make a few points. This, I speak perhaps as a resident as well, this developer has caused loads of problems. There's no doubt about it. And in my view, and they know what the conditions are and they've kind of ignored them. I think we all know that. And so what we're now asking for is to remove the conditions and trust them. Well, sorry, they've been breaking every condition up to now, so why on earth would we want to do that? And it's absolutely crazy. So, and it seems also, the proposal seems to be sort of reinforcing what's been done in the past. You know, that this developer has not adhered to the conditions. Now, these conditions were put in by this committee, as I understand it. So why on earth are we removing a condition that this committee was very happy to put in? Now, we've had loads of problems with this developer, and I'd be quite honest about it, and I think they would be honest about it as well, because I know that residents have been to see them, and they deliberately said, well, the conditions, well, we don't bother about those, we're just going to carry on regardless. Well, fine, but they should be enforced. Now, this is not mutually exclusive either. You can keep these conditions and you can also have the environmental protection as well. It's not one or the other. It's not a choice. And I think we must keep this condition in place. I think it would set an appalling precedent. It would weaken our whole position in our village. And I ask you, every one of you as members, how would you like it in your ward if you had this type of development and you couldn't enforce it? We've got this, we approved this as our committee. This committee approved it, and we should not be taking away something like this. There's no acceptable alternative but this. I accept the noise and the develop, as quite rightly been said, noise is a slightly different issue, but the point remains we need this condition in place. We need it to control it. It will set an appalling precedent to this developer. Virtually be saying to the, it doesn't matter, you can just carry on regardless. And we cannot have that. Thank you, Chair.
Well, it seems to me there are two massively overlapping issues. One is that, generally speaking, you shouldn't use planning enforcement where another regulation applies. And that is the case, so primarily we should be using environmental enforcement. Now, I asked for the report, which is in front of you, and I'm going to come back to that later. But that would apply whether it's 8 o'clock in the morning, 9 o'clock in the morning, 1 o'clock in the afternoon, or any time of day. So it seems to me that the issue of the hours of the condition are slightly erroneous, and frankly, might as well leave it as is, because it makes absolutely no practical difference whether it's 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, because, frankly, the condition either shouldn't be there at all, or it might as well stay as it is, because the issue of enforcing it would still primarily rest with environmental enforcement. So I don't see the point of changing it, because it changes nothing. And in reality, if you see what I mean, because of whatever time of day that is, it would still be primarily a matter of enforcing through environmental enforcement, unless I've got the entire planning system wrong all these years. So I don't see what difference it makes to actually move it from 8 o'clock to 9 o'clock. So unless someone can tell me what difference that makes in practical terms, I would personally leave it as it is.
Just to explain to members the consequences of the various decisions. At the moment, we have a condition. They've clearly ignored the condition. So if you choose, as the Chair has suggested, to simply leave the condition as it is and not remove it either, then in effect you are instructing officers to enforce that condition. Enforcement can be, enforcement can be persuasive dialogue, or it may have to be action in the courts. If we go to the courts and the courts look at the condition, they will look at the reason for the condition. The reason is to protect the amenities of residents. So the first thing the courts will do is decide whether work outside the hours would affect the amenity of residents. And of course, there's an awful lot of guidance that says that a decorator or an electrician might be inside a building doing fit-out works that don't affect amenity. The court will also look at the legal tests for planning conditions. Are there alternative legal regimes? And in this case, there is 3 separate Environmental Protection Acts. So there's a high risk that planning enforcement of the condition would fail for those 2 reasons.
But the point I'm trying to make is, isn't that an argument? I'm not necessarily happy with this, but isn't that an argument of saying the condition should either apply or not apply, not for changing it from 8 o'clock to 9 o'clock, if you see what I mean? Maybe I'm being dense here, but
Yes, I mean, no, the applicant asked to extend the hours, but the period they've asked for doesn't relate to the work they're doing. So we wouldn't be authorised, we wouldn't be legitimising the work that they're already doing by amending the condition. So I agree that in terms of the degree of breaches, this makes no real difference. The question I think the Chair has raised is right, is do you leave the condition on, or do you remove the condition and place a clear responsibility on the community protection team to carry out their work? Because if we were to go to court under planning enforcement for a breach of those hours, we would still be relying on a case from our community protection team that there has been an unacceptable impact on amenity and a breach of the parallel legislation to back up the planning enforcement. So
I think the fundamental question, and I know I'm stopping other people, but this is absolutely fundamental. Are you saying that this condition's existence, as it stands now, or in any form, actually stops us carrying out environmental enforcement? Because otherwise, I'd leave it as it is. I think it's a question you need to answer.
It shouldn't stop the community protection team carrying out their role, but it has in the past, because when the community protection team have received construction site noise complaints, they have deflected it back to the planning department.
But we have a solution for that here. Personally, cut short debate, because unless I can see a reason why it would undermine the enforcement case, I'm going to propose no change.
So you would be refusing the application before you, and not agreeing the office. So you'd be refusing the request for the extra hour, and you would be disagreeing with the officer's recommendation that the condition be removed.
Yes.
Yes. Thank you.
Those in favour? Or sorry, you want to speak on the... Sorry, Councillor Mumford.
I want to speak.
Absolutely. Councillor Mumford. But I was rashly assuming there would be a large level of agreement.
No, I know you want to get home for your cocoa, but... So, let me tell you how I think this works and how it works for me. I've got a site in Bolton Chelsea that's in a valley, and it rattles around that valley, and it really is noisy. They have got 7 o'clock in the morning till 1700 hours at night where they're allowed to work. They're not allowed to work with bank holidays, and on Saturday they've got 7 o'clock in the morning to 1300. Now, the way it works is next to my computer, I have got the conditions of their planning application printed out. When they work outside of those hours, I drive up to the site, show it to the foreman, he apologises and stops the work on site, because 9 times out of 10 they don't realise that the condition exists. And that has worked for me on 4 occasions now. Without the condition, I couldn't do anything. So at a lower level, when you've still got a relationship, the relationship seems to have broken down here, you can drive to the site, you have got something to hand them and say you should not be working, you wave your badge and it works. Without those working hours, I wouldn't be able to control that site. And I hope if I couldn't control the site, then enforcement would take action. But that's how I work it. I've heard one of the objectors say I would be willing for them to start an hour earlier. I would suggest that that would be more reasonable, 8 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday to 1300, and that we approve the application so people have got a tool to work with.
There is a condition already, Councillor Mumford, and what I was going on to say, and unless anyone wants to speak against this when I've finished, I am going to go to a vote, because I think the condition should be maintained, because preserving amenity is not just about noise. There are other issues. You could have vehicles driving around there with floodlights at 3 o'clock in the morning, if you don't, hypothetically. So I think we can justify maintaining the existing condition because it is not just about noise, it is about general amenity and other issues. So I think that's why I'm recommending that the committee overturn the officer's recommendation. And unless anyone wishes to add anything to those grounds or speak against it, I am going to move to vote. Councillor Cox.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I think there's just a common sense thing coming in here. We are the planning authority. We're setting a planning regulation here to say when people can work on a site. I seem to remember that this happened most of the time, I remember. And then there's the community protection team who will deal with somebody who perhaps didn't realise it was coming from the site that the noise was coming from, because they might not know. So this information should be on our website so that anybody can actually go, hang on, there's something wrong here. So I do not see what we are really beating around the bush about. Of course these people should be concerned with how their community are being affected by the development they're doing, and they should be cooperating and listening to the community. That is how we can work, and we can facilitate that from within the borough. There are places in the middle of Maidstone that I've sat outside because I had to pick somebody up, and I'm sitting looking at a big notice that says, we will not have anybody on this site if they don't have a hard hat on or they don't have a high-vis jacket. And I'm sitting there and I'm going, well, none of them have got it on. So I picked up the phone and I rang the managing director. The following day, they all had high-vis and hats on. So all we need to do is deal with this. We need to speak to the people, speak to the developer, and say this is there to be enforced, and so is our environmental team. Please let's sort this out and get on. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to move to the vote, then we'll return to those issues because you have had another piece of paper circulated to you. Because I hadn't realised it hadn't already been circulated, but it has now, and I will return to that. But first, we'll carry out the vote on what's been proposed. Those in favour? Okay, that's everyone, I think. Oh no, Councillor Vizard's not. Oh, it is now, yeah. Okay, right. Now, you have just had a piece of paper circulated. I'll do a Neville Chamberlain, shall I? And I have in my hand a piece of paper. The first section, down to just before the last 3 paragraphs, I'm proposing to have added to the minutes, which sets out the current framework we are supposed to be using. Right? So everyone will know. The final 3 aspects relate to actions that we are, as a committee, going to take forward to other parts of the council to ensure that our website and our information that is published directs people to the right places, because there has been a serious communication issue which may explain why there are so few cases. Because if you're not directing people to the right place to take the cases forward in the first place, it does tend to depress the level of cases that get taken up. So I'm sorry this wasn't circulated earlier. This came out only at a pre-meeting on Tuesday, and I would like members' agreement to have these entered into them. The first section down to complied with, added to the minutes, and the final 3 actions at the bottom carried forward on behalf of this committee to other sections of the council. Is everyone clear what I'm saying? Any seconder, please? Councillor Round, thank you very much. All those in favour? That's everyone. That should make things a lot clearer going forward. I thank you for your indulgence and for your assistance for drawing up that list at my request. Thank you. That was very useful and very helpful.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't want to...
No, this is all right. No, this is all right. We move on to item 19, which is Boxley Close, Maidstone, but There is no speaker on this. Does anyone wish to have the report introduced? If not, I will simply move the recommendation. Right, great. That brings us to the deferred appeal reports from last time. I'm sure that the officers will add things, but I think it's fair to say that with the exception of the perennial issue, and we all know what I mean by that, it's actually quite a good set of results. Did you wish to add?
Thank you, Chair. I won't go through any of the individual decisions themselves, but committee will recall that at previous meetings you expressed concern about the apparent lack of support that we were getting from planning inspectors in terms of the general trend of decisions and their failure to recognise an up-to-date adopted plan. I'm pleased to report, and hopefully if the Downs Mail are listening, they can write an accurate report for a change, that in relation to householder and small developments, we succeeded in having all but one case dismissed. 100% of small development appeals were refused. And I've been through each decision letter, and it's quite clear that inspectors in this period have given support to the local plan policies, and they've upheld the council's view in all cases where we've expressed concern regarding the impact of the development on, for example, character and appearance, because I know you were concerned before that you weren't getting the benefit of the doubt on that subjective test. So it is a particularly good set of results, and if we compared it against the Kent average, it would be higher. We will have to see whether it continues into the next period, but if it did, then I think to some extent your concerns have been responded to. There are other appeals that have come in since these, and at the moment there's a balanced set of decisions. As the Chair pointed out, there have been 2 appeal decisions on isolated dwellings in the countryside, very similar circumstances. One inspector said that it was not sustainable, the other said it was. There's a clear subjectivity on this issue, as we know. I don't think we'll ever get a series of parameters that define what is and isn't acceptable in a rural location. But as far as the results here are concerned, it's been a very positive set of decisions.
Okay, any burning questions? Councillor Perry.
Not a question, I just wanted to say, I mean, this is an issue of concern, particularly, let's be honest, some of the G&T, Gypsy and Traveller ones, which clearly, it is work in progress because, as Martin has said, we've both written to our respective MPs just highlighting that it is an issue, and it's particularly the point you made about the inspectorate, and you've made it, Chairman, and I totally support what you said. We need to follow this up, and hopefully, if I hear anything, I mean, obviously, I'll keep this committee, obviously, in
Absolutely,
the future.
but we do need to do, in relation to one part of this issue, our own work as a council, and I'm not talking about planning here. Okay, thank you very much, members. Thank you, Councillor, for your input, and thank you, officers.